She built walls so high that even she forgot what she was hiding from, until a 6-year-old girl walked through the front door of a Manhattan diner and decided, without asking anyone's permission, that Megan Carter was exactly who she'd been looking for. Megan had spent 4 years making herself small, 4 years of early shifts and tired feet, and a piano she hadn't touched since she moved to the city. She was good at disappearing inside ordinary days. She thought she'd gotten away with it. Then Ava Sterling sat down at the counter, looked up at her with those wide, unguarded eyes, and said, "You look like someone who used to be happy. Some things you can't unhear. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels." Now, let's begin. The morning rush at Carver's Diner ended the way it always did. Not with any particular event, just a gradual thinning of bodies and a drop in noise that Megan Carter could feel in her shoulders before she was consciously aware of it. Plates stopped clattering. The espresso machine went quiet. The last of the office workers disappeared through the glass door, letting in a brief gust of October air before it swung shut again behind them. Megan stood at the counter with a damp cloth and started wiping down the surface in long, even strokes. The routine of it was the point. She'd learned that about herself over the years. She needed tasks that didn't require her to think too hard. Wiping down counters, refilling sugar dispensers, writing out the daily specials on the chalkboard in the careful, deliberate handwriting that her coworker Danny once said looked like it belonged in a museum. "You got handwriting like somebody's grandmother," he'd told her once, not unkindly. "Thanks, Danny. I meant it as a compliment." "I know you did." That was a year ago, maybe more. Danny was gone now, moved back to Columbus for reasons he never fully explained, and Megan had taken on most of his morning shifts without being asked. Not because she needed the money, though the money helped, mostly because the alternative was spending those hours in her apartment on West 104th, sitting near the covered piano and thinking about all the reasons she'd covered it in the first place. She was 31 years old, she had been in New York for 4 years, and she had, by most measurable standards, failed at the things she came here to do. The music career hadn't happened. The conservatory audition she'd spent 2 years preparing for had gone badly. Not catastrophically. Not in any way she could point to and say, that specific moment is where it fell apart, but badly enough that when the rejection letter arrived, she'd felt something in her chest that she could only describe as relief, which was its own kind of disaster. After that, she'd let things drift. A few lessons, a few students, a few sessions playing background music at corporate events where nobody listened. Then the gig economy of the creative life had worn her down in the way it wears everyone down who isn't either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily connected, and she'd taken the job at Carver's thinking it would be temporary. That was 3.5 years ago. She wasn't unhappy, exactly. That was the thing she kept coming back to whenever she tried to examine her life with any honesty. She wasn't unhappy. She just wasn't much of anything. She'd settled into a kind of emotional neutral, functional, mostly pleasant, occasionally tired, and she'd told herself on the days when she needed a story that this was what stability looked like, that not everyone got to have the big blazing life they'd imagined at 22. Most days she believed it. The bell above the door rang at 10:47. Megan didn't look up right away. She finished the section of counter she was working on and draped the cloth over the edge of the sink before she turned. Her first impression was of height. The man who came through the door was tall, mid-30s probably, in a dark jacket that looked expensive without trying to announce itself. He had the slightly distracted look of someone who'd been doing too many things at once and hadn't fully arrived wherever he was going. His phone was in his hand, though he wasn't looking at it. And at his side, holding his hand with the casual confidence of someone who has never once worried about being a burden, was a small girl. She was maybe 5 or 6, with dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that suggested someone had tried their best but hadn't quite nailed it. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket despite the fact that it wasn't raining and showed no signs of doing so. She was looking around the diner with the specific, evaluating attention that children bring to places when they've decided to take them seriously. Megan moved toward them on instinct. "Sit anywhere you like. I'll be right with you." The man nodded without really focusing on her. He was already scanning the diner, checking exits maybe, or just orienting himself the way certain people did in unfamiliar spaces. The way that came from spending too much time in situations where knowing the room mattered. The little girl, though, was looking directly at Megan. They settled into a booth by the window. Megan gave them a minute, refilled the coffee for the two remaining customers at the far end of the counter, and then came over with menus she was fairly certain they wouldn't need. "Good morning," she said. "Can I start you both off with something to drink?" "Coffee," the man said, still not entirely there. He'd set his phone on the table face down, which Megan recognized as the move of someone trying to be present and not quite succeeding at it. "And for you?" Megan looked at the girl. "Hot chocolate," the girl said. "Please." She added the please as an afterthought, but with genuine intention behind it, the way kids did when the politeness was actually theirs and not just installed by repetition. "Coming right up?" Megan turned to go. She'd taken exactly 2 steps when the girl's voice came again. "What's your name?" Megan looked back. The girl was watching her with complete, uncomplicated curiosity. No shyness, no hesitation. Just the question sitting there in the open air between them. "Megan," she said. The girl considered this. "I'm Ava. That's my Uncle Ethan. He's not in a bad mood. He just looks like it sometimes." The man, Ethan, closed his eyes briefly. "Ava." "It's true," Ava said without defensiveness, just as a matter of record. Megan felt something move through her that she wasn't prepared to name. "I'll go get those drinks." She made the hot chocolate properly. Real cocoa powder, a splash of cream, the small things that cost nothing but time, and set it in front of Ava with a miniature marshmallow she found at the back of the condiment cabinet. She hadn't known it was there. Her hand had found it the way hands sometimes found things they needed. Ava's face did something complicated and then settled into pure delight. "Uncle Ethan," she said, "look." He looked at the cup. Then for the first time he looked at Megan. Really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but actually at her. And she caught something in his expression that she recognized without being able to explain why. It was the look of someone who had gotten so used to holding everything together that they'd stopped noticing how tired their hands were. "Thank you," he said. "No problem." She pulled out her order pad. "You ready, or do you need another minute?" "Another minute," he said. "Sorry, don't be." She went back to the counter. She could hear Ava telling him something about the diner, the black and white tile floor, the specific shade of red on the vinyl seats, the way the light came through the window and landed on the table in a rectangle that she described as a door for something small. Megan stood with her back to them and listened to the child talk and felt, without quite understanding it, that something in the quality of the morning had shifted. They ordered eggs. Ava got pancakes and interrogated them when they arrived, wanting to know whether the blueberries were fresh or frozen. "Frozen," Megan told her. "Honest answer." "That's okay," Ava said gravely. "I like them both." Ethan ate without speaking much, not rudely. He wasn't the kind of quiet that pushed people away, more the kind that had simply learned to take up less space. He cut his eggs with precise, unhurried movements. He drank his coffee black and didn't make any face about it, which Megan had always found to be a reasonable personality indicator, though she kept that metric to herself. At some point, Ava asked Megan if she could see the kitchen. "Ava," Ethan said, "I want to see where the pancakes come from." "You know where pancakes come from." "Not these pancakes specifically." Megan glanced at Joe, the line cook, through the pass-through window. He was reading something on his phone and would not particularly care. "I can take you back for a quick look," she said, "if your uncle says it's okay." Ethan looked at her, then at Ava. Then he made the particular kind of surrender that adults made when they decided the fight wasn't worth it. "Fine, but you don't touch anything." "I know," Ava said, and was already sliding out of the booth. The kitchen tour lasted 7 minutes and consisted primarily of Ava asking Joe a series of increasingly specific questions about the griddle temperature and whether the spatula had a name. Joe, to his credit, answered all of them with complete seriousness. When they came back out, Ethan had finished his coffee and was staring at the table with the expression of someone who had been sitting with a thought they didn't know what to do with. He looked up when they came through the swinging door. Something in his face settled when he saw Ava. A small, involuntary unclenching, and Megan filed that away without meaning to. "Joe says the spatula's name is Steve," Ava reported, climbing back into the booth. "Does it?" "He named it after his father." That's... Ethan paused. That's actually kind of nice. I thought so too. Ava picked up what remained of her hot chocolate. Megan plays piano, she said, as though this followed naturally from the spatula conversation. Ethan looked at Megan. Does she? I noticed your hands, Ava explained to Megan, with the frankness of someone who saw no reason to be indirect about the things they observed. The way they were moving on the counter when you were thinking. My mom used to do that. The air between all three of them went quiet. Not uncomfortably. Or not only uncomfortably. More like the way a room went quiet when something real had just been said in it. Your mom played piano? Megan asked carefully. She played everything, Ava said. Then she returned to her hot chocolate as though the conversation was complete. Ethan was looking at the table again. His jaw had changed shape. Megan picked up the check she'd already written and set it down near the edge of the table. No rush, she said. Whenever you're ready. She went back to the counter. She started refilling the napkin dispensers because they didn't need it, and she needed something to do with her hands. They came back 3 days later. Same booth, same order. Ava in the yellow rain jacket again. Apparently it was a permanent feature, not weather-dependent. And Ethan with the same distracted energy that slowly settled as the morning went on, like sediment. Megan brought the hot chocolate before Ava asked for it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just set it down with the marshmallow and moved on. And she caught, from the corner of her eye, the way Ava looked at the cup and then up at her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness that lodged itself somewhere in Megan's chest and didn't move. That visit they stayed longer. Ava had found a loose thread on the vinyl seat and was engineering its removal with focused patience. Ethan drank 2 cups of coffee and eventually stopped checking his watch. She talks about this place, he said, during one of the lulls. He said it like he was slightly confused by it, and slightly not. It's a good diner, Megan said. She talks about you, specifically. Megan didn't know what to do with that, so she refilled his coffee. She doesn't take to people that easily, he said. Normally. Kids can tell, Megan said, when something's real versus when someone's performing at them. They figure it out fast. Ethan looked at her. You spent time around kids? Some? I taught piano lessons for a while. 6 to 12 mostly. She hadn't meant to say that much. She picked up the coffee pot and straightened. It was a while back. What happened? She looked at him. He seemed genuinely curious and not in the way people sometimes were. Not the way that was actually about themselves. I stopped, she said. It just didn't fit anymore. Which was not the whole truth, but was also not nothing. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. He didn't push. She appreciated that more than she knew how to say. When they left, Ava hugged Megan. Not an asking hug. She didn't tilt her head or look for permission. She just walked up and put her arms around Megan's waist and held on for a 3 count, and then pulled back and said, Same time next week? Megan looked at Ethan over the top of Ava's head. He raised both hands in a small gesture that meant, Don't look at me. I just live here. Sure. Sure, Megan said. Same time next week. They became, over the course of October, something she didn't have a word for. Not regulars. She had regulars. She knew what regulars were. Regulars were people whose orders she knew, whose names she learned, who smiled at her on their way in and on their way out, and whose lives existed entirely outside the 40 minutes they spent at Carver's. Ethan and Ava were something more porous than that. Their visits left residue. She thought about them between Tuesdays. She found out, in pieces, that Ava's parents had died the previous year. A car accident on the Merritt Parkway in February. Black ice, a concrete barrier, the kind of thing that happened fast and left everyone around it to deal with it slowly. Ava had been with Ethan that weekend, visiting him in the city. She'd come back to a different life. Ethan was her mother's brother. He'd been named guardian in the will, which Megan gathered had surprised him, even though he'd agreed to it when asked, because he was the kind of person who agreed to things and then spent the next several months figuring out whether he'd been right to. She didn't learn all of this at once. It came out sideways, the way information did when nobody was trying to deliver it. Ava mentioned her mom's hands once. Ethan said something about school enrollment and then stopped himself and looked out the window for a moment before coming back. Megan learned to hold these pieces without asking for more of them, and the not asking seemed to matter. For her part, she didn't say much about herself. She wasn't secretive about it. She'd answer a direct question, but she didn't volunteer things in the way she once had, before New York, before the audition and the aftermath and the slow, quiet decision to become someone smaller and easier to maintain. Ava didn't let her get away with it entirely. "Do you have a piano?" she asked one Tuesday while eating her pancakes with systematic efficiency. "At home. Yeah." "Do you play it?" "Not lately." Ava considered this. "Why not?" "Ava," Ethan said, "it's a real question. It's a personal question. Most questions are personal." Ethan looked at Megan with an expression that said, "I'm sorry, I have no control over this." Megan found that she didn't mind. "I will play it again," she said to Ava. "I just haven't figured out when yet." Ava seemed to find this acceptable. "Okay," she said, and went back to her pancakes. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then, "That was diplomatic." "I meant it." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." Awesome. The first time she met him outside the diner was an accident, late November. She'd taken her day off to walk through the park, something she did sometimes when the apartment felt too close. And she came around a bend in the path, and there they were, Ethan and Ava, in front of the conservatory garden with its bare winter beds and its quiet. Ava saw her first. She broke into a run that was more of a controlled lurch and collided with Megan at roughly waist height. "You're here," she said, as though Megan's presence in a public park was a minor miracle. "I live here," Megan said. "Roughly." "We come here every Sunday," Ava told her. "It's our thing." Megan looked at Ethan, who had walked over at a more measured pace and was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking slightly caught out, as though he'd been found doing something he wasn't sure he was supposed to be doing. "Hi," he said. "Hi." "We were going to get lunch," Ava said. "Do you want to come?" "Ava?" But there was no heat in it. "What?" "She might want to come." Megan stood in the cold November air with the bare garden behind her and a small girl looking up at her with complete expectant certainty, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in long enough that it took her a moment to recognize it, something that resembled wanting. "Sure," she said. "I could eat." Ethan's expression did something she couldn't quite read. Not unhappy. Closer to relieved, actually, in a way that confused her and then didn't. "There's a good Thai place," he said. "On Madison, if that works." "Thai works." They walked out of the park together, Ava between them and slightly ahead, the way children always were, leading into whatever came next without any of the adult machinery of hesitation or second-guessing. And Megan noticed that she was walking at a different pace than she usually did, slower, more present. She thought, this is what it feels like to not be in a hurry to get to the next thing. She thought, I forgot this. Lunch lasted 2 hours. Nobody planned for it to. It just kept going because nobody stopped it. Ava ate her noodles with a spoon instead of chopsticks, without apology, and dominated the first 40 minutes with a detailed account of something that had happened at school involving a class hamster named Gerald, and a series of events that remained, even at the conclusion of the story, somewhat unclear in their causation. Ethan listened with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to give narratives the room they needed. When Ava finally ran out of Gerald-related content and turned her attention to the fish tank near the restaurant entrance, the table went quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. "She's been better lately," Ethan said, quietly, like he was telling it to the table as much as to Megan. "I can tell," Megan said. "She seems more settled than when I first met her." She was pretty shut down for a while. After. He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking from it. She'd go whole meals without talking, which, if you know Ava, not like her. Not remotely like her. He looked toward the fish tank, where Ava had her forehead pressed against the glass. The school counselor said it was normal, the silence, that kids process differently than adults. That's true. I know it's true. He stopped, started again. I kept thinking if I could just fix the right thing. Like there was a specific thing to fix and I was missing it. Megan looked at him. He was still watching Ava, and she had the sense that he was telling her something he hadn't told many people. Not because it was secret, but because he didn't often say the unfinished thoughts out loud. I don't think it works like that, she said. The grief stuff. I don't think there's usually a specific thing. No. He finally drank his water. No, I know that now. A pause. You lost someone, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Megan was quiet for a moment. The restaurant noise moved around them. A table of women laughing, someone's phone going off, the ambient business of other people's lives. My dad, she said. When I was in college, he was sick for a long time, so it wasn't sudden, but she stopped, considered. But it's never really about whether it's sudden or not, is it? It's just about the space that's there afterward. Ethan looked at her then, and she met it. Yeah, he said, exactly that. Ava came back from the fish tank with a full report on the population dynamics of the aquarium. Ethan listened. Megan listened. The restaurant went on around them, and outside on Madison Avenue, the city did what it always did. Moved and moved and moved. And inside that booth on a Sunday in late November, Megan Carter felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was somewhere she'd actually chosen to be. December arrived the way it always did in New York, too fast and too loud, and with a specific kind of beauty that required you to be cold to access it. She started looking forward to Tuesdays the way she'd once looked forward to performance days. That particular shift in the quality of waking up, the way anticipation lived in the body before the mind caught up with it. She didn't examine it too closely. She'd learned that about herself. She examined things to death sometimes, turned them over until the life went out of them. And she didn't want to do that here. She wanted to just let it be what it was. A friendship, 2 adults and a child in a diner on the Upper West Side, and a morning a week where the hours passed at the right speed. Ethan was not what she'd assumed in those first minutes when he'd walked through the door. She'd read him as remote, maybe cold, the kind of person who kept the world at a careful distance. And he did, some of the time, but it was more specific than that. It was the remoteness of someone who'd learned to manage their own pain very efficiently, which was different from not having the capacity to be present. When he was present, he was fully there. He listened in a way that felt rare, asked questions that suggested he'd actually been thinking about what she'd said, noticed things she didn't say. That noticing made her slightly nervous. She wasn't used to being noticed. You're different when you talk about music, he told her one Tuesday, a week before Christmas. Different how? More alive. He said it plainly, not trying to flatter her, just describing what he saw. That's a lot to hear, she said. I don't mean it critically. I know. She looked at her own hands on the counter. It's just, you notice things. Occupational hazard. What do you do exactly? He'd mentioned his work in passing, something in finance, something that involved a lot of meetings and a lot of other people's decisions. But she'd never had the full picture. I run a private equity firm, he said. Smallish. We invest in... He paused, and she could tell he was gauging how deep into it to go. Companies that are going through transitions, usually struggling ones. We come in, figure out what's broken, try to fix it. What kinds of things are broken? Leadership, usually, or structure, sometimes both. He drank his coffee. People problems that show up as money problems. Huh. She thought about that. So you spend a lot of time figuring out what's actually wrong versus what looks like it's wrong. He looked at her with slight surprise. Yeah, exactly. I can see why you'd notice things, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm better at it with companies than people, he said. For the record, she laughed. It came out of her without warning. That's reassuring. I'm just being honest. No, I know. I appreciate it. She was still smiling when she picked up the coffee pot to refill the cup at the far end of the counter. She could feel him watching her go, but it wasn't a heavy feeling. It sat lightly, whatever it was. Christmas Eve. She worked a half shift and walked home through a city that looked, for once, exactly like the city she'd imagined when she was 18 in Cincinnati, listening to the Gershwin records her father kept in the living room. She stood in the doorway of her apartment and looked at the piano. It was a small upright, a Yamaha she'd bought secondhand in her second year of the city, when she'd still believed that buying the instrument was a sign of commitment, a way of anchoring herself to the life she'd planned. She'd covered it in September, 8 months ago, with an old blanket she used to use in college. She told herself she was protecting it from dust. She walked over to it. She pulled the blanket off slowly, the way you pulled a bandage off slowly. Not because it would hurt less, but because you needed to see what you were dealing with. The keys were slightly dusty. She wiped them with the edge of her sleeve. She sat down on the bench. The bench creaked under her weight, and she thought, I haven't sat here in 8 months. And before that it had been longer, and before that longer still. She put her hands on the keys. She didn't play a piece. She just played a chord. A simple C major chord, 3 notes, nothing you'd call music, and then held it until it faded. And in the fading of it, something in her chest cracked, just slightly, just enough. She thought about Ava saying, You look like someone who used to be happy. She thought, maybe the problem isn't that I'm unhappy. Maybe the problem is I'm used to it. She played another chord, and then another. Not a song, not yet. Just a conversation with something she'd been refusing to speak to. Outside, the city moved through its Christmas Eve the way the city always moved, without slowing, without ceremony, without waiting for anyone to be ready. But in the apartment on West 104th, for the first time in a long time, Megan Carter sat at a piano and played. She didn't tell anyone. That was important to her, in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She needed to sit with it first. She needed it to be hers before she offered it to anyone else's interpretation. The new year arrived, and January settled over Manhattan with the flat, gray persistence of cold that wasn't dramatic, just unrelenting. Ethan and Ava came on their Tuesdays. Megan started opening the piano at night, after her shifts, when the apartment was quiet enough that she could hear herself think. She started remembering things. Technical things first. How to hold her wrists, how to voice a chord so the melody sat on top. Then, the less technical things, the harder things. The way a phrase could mean something different depending on how much space you gave it. The way patience was musical, not just personal. One Tuesday in late January, Ava climbed onto the stool at the counter and looked at Megan with that evaluating intensity she brought to things that mattered to her. You've been playing, she said. Megan stared at her. How? Your hands are different, Ava pointed. The calluses are coming back. Megan looked at her own fingers. She hadn't noticed. Ethan looked up from his coffee. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, careful, interested, trying not to make too much of something in case making too much of it would scare it away. I've been playing a little, Megan said. Yeah. Can I hear sometime? Ava asked. Ava, Ethan said. That's a real question, too. It's a very real question. It's okay, Megan said. She looked at Ava. Maybe sometime. Yeah. Ava looked at Ethan. She said yes. She said maybe. Same thing. Ethan met Megan's eyes over Ava's head. He was trying not to smile and not quite managing it. Megan felt the warmth of that, the shared amusement of 2 adults caught in the orbit of a small person with very specific ideas about the world. And underneath the warmth was something quieter, something more serious, something she still wasn't ready to name. But it was there. She was starting to think it had been there for a while. February brought the anniversary of the accident, and for the first time Ethan missed a Tuesday. He texted her, which was itself a thing she held carefully, the fact that they'd exchanged numbers in some organic way she couldn't precisely trace, a message that said only, Ava's having a hard week. We'll be in next Tuesday. And then, after a pause, sorry. She texted back, don't apologize, tell her I said hi. She worked that Tuesday with the extra attention she sometimes gave to difficult days, filling everything in, staying occupied, not letting the gaps get too long. When the morning rush ended, she stood at the counter with the damp cloth and thought about a small girl in a yellow rain jacket who had walked into a diner 4 months ago and decided, apparently without any particular evidence, that Megan was someone worth deciding on. She thought about what it meant to be chosen like that, without conditions, without explanation. She thought, I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to let people in and trust that the letting in won't eventually require me to lose them. She thought, but I think I might be doing it anyway. She wrung out the cloth over the sink. She looked out the window at the February street where people walked fast and kept their faces down against the cold. She thought, that has to mean something. The Tuesday after that, they came back. Ava ate her pancakes. The marshmallow was in the hot chocolate before she could ask for it. Ethan drank his coffee and, at some point during the quiet section of the morning, looked at Megan with the particular honesty that she'd come to understand was just how he operated. Not softened, not performed, just real. "Thank you," he said, "for the text." "Of course." He looked at his coffee. She cried for about an hour, and then she wanted to look at photos on my phone. The two of us sat on the couch for the rest of the night, going through everything I had. He stopped, seemed to consider whether to keep going. It was, I don't know, terrible and also not terrible. "Yeah," Megan said softly. "That's how it goes." He looked at her. "Have you gotten there yet? With your dad?" She thought about it honestly. "Some days. Not all of them." He nodded, and they sat for a moment in the shared acknowledgement of it, the long, uneven business of carrying loss. And Megan thought, this is real. What is happening in this diner on this Tuesday morning is a real thing between real people who are genuinely trying. She thought, I should probably figure out what I'm going to do about that. But she let it sit, for now. She let it be what it was, because some things needed time, and she was starting, slowly, to believe she had some. By March, she was playing for an hour every night. By the end of March, she was playing 2. She didn't have a plan. She hadn't made any decisions. She was simply sitting at the instrument and letting it be complicated, letting herself remember what it felt like to be inside a piece of music, rather than watching it from the outside. She was relearning that music was not the thing she'd failed at. It was the thing she'd run from, because failing at it had hurt too much to face. Those were different problems. She thought about her piano students from years ago. A boy named Marcus who could never feel the pulse but had perfect pitch. A girl who cried every time she made a mistake until Megan taught her to breathe between errors. The 8-year-old who played ragtime at a school recital and looked up at the audience afterward with the expression of someone who had just discovered something they were going to keep forever. She missed it. She missed the teaching. She missed being the person who handed the keys of something to someone who needed them. She thought, maybe that's somewhere to start. It wasn't a plan. It was just a direction. But she'd learned that sometimes a direction was enough. That you didn't have to see the whole road. You just had to be willing to take the next step and trust that the road was actually there. She played until midnight on a Thursday in late March. When she finally stopped, her hands were sore in the good way. The way that meant she'd worked, not the way that meant she'd hurt herself. And she sat in the quiet of her apartment with the music still in her head and the city murmuring outside and something in her chest that felt, cautiously, like it might be the first edge of hope. She thought about Ethan. She thought about Ava saying, "You look like someone who used to be happy." She thought, I'm starting to think she might have been right about more than that. And she let herself, just this once, in the late-night quiet of an apartment where nobody could see her do it, want the thing that was forming in front of her. The shape of it, the warmth of it, the terrifying and ordinary possibility of it. She let herself want it, just that, just for tonight. Tomorrow she'd figure out what to do about it. Spring came to Manhattan the way it always did. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. The trees along West 104th budding and then going still as though reconsidering. The city pulling its coat back on and then shedding it again, back and forth, until sometime in mid-April the warmth finally won and the coats stayed home and people walked differently, the way they always did when the season finally committed. Megan noticed it most in the diner. Spring changed the morning traffic. People lingered more, ordered things they wouldn't have in February, sat by the window and looked at the street with the particular expression of people who had survived winter and weren't quite ready to stop being grateful about it. The tips got better in spring, which she wasn't proud to track, but did, anyway. What she noticed more, though, was that the Tuesdays had become the fixed point around which the rest of her week moved. She hadn't named it. She was still careful about naming things. But she knew it the same way she knew when a piece of music was about to resolve. Not from thinking it through, but from the way the body recognized the shape of something before the mind caught up. Ethan had started coming in on Thursdays sometimes, without Ava, who was in school. He would sit at the counter instead of the booth, which felt like a different category of visit, something more deliberate, and he'd have one cup of coffee, and they'd talk across the counter for however long the morning allowed before things got busy again. He never stayed more than 40 minutes. He always seemed slightly surprised at how long he'd been there. "Don't you have a company to run?" she asked him one Thursday in early April. "My assistant thinks I'm at a site visit." Megan looked at him. "You lied to your assistant. I said I'd be working remotely for the first part of the morning. That's a lie by omission. That's a philosophical position. It's really not." He smiled into his coffee. It was a specific smile she'd cataloged without meaning to. The one that showed up when she said something that caught him off guard, slightly reluctant, like he was giving it to her against his better judgment. "I like it here in the morning," he said. "Before things start. Before the day gets going." She understood that. She didn't need to say so. "What's the site visit supposed to be?" she asked. "A manufacturing company in the Bronx, family-owned, second generation. The son took over from the father 2 years ago, and he's struggling." "What kind of struggling?" He wrapped both hands around his mug. "The kind where the numbers look fine on the surface, but the people underneath them are all quietly looking for other jobs. The kind where the problem is that everyone misses the father, but nobody can say it because the son is standing right there doing his best." Megan was quiet for a moment. "That's a sad problem. Most of the real problems are." She refilled his coffee without being asked. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it, which was its own kind of noticing. "What do you actually do about it?" she said. "In a situation like that, you try to figure out what the son is good at that the father wasn't. And then you find ways to make that visible. You can't replace what's gone. You can only redirect." He stopped, seemed to realize he was saying more than he'd planned. "Anyway, no, that's interesting. I'm boring you with work stuff." "You're not boring me," she said, plainly, without the softening she might have added a few months ago. He looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. It wasn't a big moment. She wouldn't have been able to point to it and say, "There, that was when things changed." But there was something different in the way he looked at her after that. Something that had stopped waiting for permission. The Thursday visits kept happening. Neither of them acknowledged that they were a pattern. Ava, for her part, had begun treating the diner less like a restaurant and more like an extension of her own living space. She'd started bringing things with her on Tuesdays, a library book once, which she read at the counter while eating her pancakes, holding it propped against the napkin dispenser with the focused absorption of someone who had been reading since before it was expected of her. Another time she brought a small notebook and spent the visit drawing portraits of everyone in the diner, presenting them to their subjects with complete confidence in her own accuracy. She gave Megan's portrait to Megan at the end of the visit. Megan looked at it for a long moment. The Megan in the drawing had larger eyes than Megan actually had, and the proportions were somewhere between a person and a suggestion of a person. But there was something in the posture, the way the drawn figure was leaning slightly forward, head tilted, that was undeniably her. "You got me," she said. Ava nodded, as though this was expected. Ethan leaned over to look. "She got the eyes right," he said. "I have regular-sized eyes," Megan said. "You have attentive eyes." He straightened up. "That's what she drew." Megan looked at the portrait again. She put it in her apron pocket and kept it there for the rest of her shift. And when she got home, she put it on the refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a taxicab that had been there since she moved in. She stood back and looked at it. She thought, this is what it looks like when you let people in a little bit at a time and don't even notice it's happening until it already has. She thought, I don't know whether that's terrifying or the best thing that's happened to me in years. She was fairly sure, if she was being honest, that it was both. The conversation about her music happened on the second Tuesday of April, during a lull so complete that the diner felt almost theatrical in its quiet. Just the sound of the refrigerator unit behind the counter and the distant percussion of Joe doing something in the kitchen and the soft, particular silence of a city morning between rushes. Ava had finished her pancakes and was now doing something complicated with the paper from her straw. Ethan had his elbows on the counter and was looking at Megan with the directness that she'd stopped flinching from sometime around February. "Ava tells me you've been practicing," he said. "Ava," Megan said, "you told on me." "I didn't tell on you," Ava said, without looking up from her straw wrapper project. "I told about you. There's a difference." What is the difference specifically? Ava considered. Telling on you would be bad. Telling about you is just information. And what information exactly did you share? That your hands look like a piano player's again. She held up the straw wrapper, which had been folded into something that might have been a crane or might have been a very small hat. Also, I told him you seemed happier. The counter went quiet. Megan looked at Ethan. He had the expression of someone who had been delivered information they already suspected and wasn't sure whether they were allowed to be glad about it. Are you? He said. Happier. She stopped. Thought about it honestly, the way she'd been making herself do lately. I'm something, I don't know if happier is the right word, more like awake. More like I remembered a thing about myself that I'd put down somewhere and couldn't find. What thing? That music isn't something I'm good at or bad at. It's the way I think. It's how I process things. She heard herself saying it and felt slightly exposed and kept going anyway. I spent 3 years telling myself I'd failed at it, but you can't really fail at the way your brain works. You can just refuse to use it for a while. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then, what happened to make you stop? I auditioned for something I really wanted, and I didn't get it. She said it flatly, without the softening she used to wrap around it. And instead of being sad about it for a year and then trying again, I just folded. I decided the rejection meant something bigger than it did. I let it be an answer when it was just an event. He stopped. Painfully clear in retrospect, I know. I was going to say that's something a lot of people do. I know, it's still embarrassing. It's human. Yeah, well, she picked up the coffee pot even though his cup was mostly full. Turns out I am that. He reached out and put his hand briefly over her hand on the counter, not holding it, just landing there for a second, a contact that was more acknowledgement than anything else. And then he pulled back and reached for his coffee, and she stood there with the pot and felt the warmth of that gesture moving through her in a way that was disproportionate to its size and completely proportionate to what it had meant. Ava looked up from her straw wrapper. Are you two having a moment? She asked. Because I can look away if you need. Please look away, Megan said. Okay, said Ava, and very deliberately looked in the opposite direction. They went to the park that Sunday. All three of them, on purpose this time, planned, or the nearest thing to planning that their particular dynamic seemed to allow, which was that Ethan had texted on Friday to say, we're doing the park Sunday, if you're around, and she'd texted back, I'm around, and that had been the entire negotiation. Ava ran ahead on the path the way she always did, maintaining a distance of 20 feet that she never let grow beyond 30, a range that Megan had come to understand was the child's way of being independent while staying connected. It was a skill that took most adults decades to develop, and Ava appeared to have arrived with it already installed. Ethan walked next to Megan with his hands in his jacket pockets. The April air was doing what April air did, warm enough to not need a heavy coat, cold enough to want one anyway. And the park was full of the particular Sunday population of New York, runners and dog walkers and couples with strollers and older men playing chess at the stone tables near the path. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. You usually just ask. This one I'm preambling. She looked at him. Okay. What would it look like? If you went back to music? Not performing necessarily, but what would you actually want? She'd been thinking about this for weeks. She'd been thinking about it in the way she thought about technical problems, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to see what it actually was rather than what she was afraid it was. Teaching, she said. I think I want to teach again. Piano lessons? Piano lessons, but more structured than what I was doing before. I was just doing it piecemeal, one student here, one there. I want something with more intention, a real program, maybe a small studio. She heard herself talking and registered the unusual sensation of saying a future tense thing out loud without immediately trying to take it back. I know it doesn't sound like anything except a good idea. I was going to say I know it sounds vague. It's not that vague. He was quiet for a moment, watching Ava stop to examine something on the path, a beetle, possibly, or a pebble with an interesting shape. You'd be good at it? You've never heard me play. I've watched you with Ava for 5 months. He glanced at her sideways. You'd be good at it. She let that sit. Outside, a dog barked at a squirrel. Ava straightened up and continued down the path. The city went about its Sunday. What made you start? She asked. The firm. The whole private equity thing. He took a breath. My father had a company. Small manufacturing business. Nothing glamorous. He built it from nothing. Took him 30 years. He paused. He made some bad decisions in the last few years before he retired. Trusted the wrong people. The company got into trouble and he couldn't fix it because he was too inside it to see clearly. What happened to it? It went under. The words were even, controlled. Not dramatically. Just slowly and then all at once. And I watched it happen, and I was 28, and I didn't have any of the tools to help him, and He stopped. So you got the tools, Megan said. So I got the tools. She looked at him, at the particular set of his shoulders, the way he carried the story in his body without quite carrying it in his face. Does it help? She said. Being able to do now what you couldn't do then? He thought about it. Sometimes. Sometimes it's just a way of staying busy that has good justification. That's the most honest thing you've said about yourself. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Yeah, he said. Probably. Ava turned around 20 feet ahead and called back. There are dogs! She was pointing at a cluster of dogs near the reservoir entrance, their owners tangled in leashes in conversation. Can we go? Ethan looked at Megan. She shrugged. He called back. Go ahead. Stay where we can see you. Ava went. They walked after her at their own pace, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and Megan thought, this feels like something, simple and specific. This, the three of them in this park on this Sunday, felt like something she'd been pointing toward for a long time, from direction she hadn't understood were pointing anywhere. The Friday night she finally played for Ava happened accidentally, the way the significant things always seem to in their particular story. It was late April. Ethan had called, not texted, called, which was still something she registered because it was rarer, to ask if she might be willing to watch Ava for 2 hours Friday evening. His regular sitter had canceled. He had a dinner he couldn't move. I wouldn't ask if I had another option, he said. He said it carefully, like he was aware it was a line that could be taken wrong. It's fine, she said. I don't mind. You're sure? Ethan, I'm sure. There was a small pause on the line. Okay, he said. Thank you. She gave him her address and he brought Ava over at 6:30. Ava arrived with a backpack that contained a library book, a bag of goldfish crackers, and a small stuffed elephant named, apparently, Franklin. Franklin's been with her since she was 3, Ethan said, in the tone of someone supplying context they didn't ask for permission to supply. Franklin is distinguished, Megan said. Franklin is very well traveled, Ava said. Ethan stayed for 2 minutes, checked twice that Megan had his number, looked at Ava with the expression of a man who understood that his worry was irrational and felt it anyway, and left. They ate dinner. Megan made pasta, the slightly complicated kind with the roasted tomatoes, because cooking for someone was a thing she did when she was trying. And Ava ate with the focused appreciation of a child who knew what good food was and wasn't going to waste it on small talk. Afterward, Ava wandered the apartment with the comfortable curiosity of someone who'd decided they were welcome, touching things lightly, reading spines. She stopped at the piano. You have it uncovered, she said. I've been playing. Ava stood in front of the Yamaha with her arms folded, the way she stood when she was thinking carefully about something. Can I hear you? Megan was in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel. She looked at the piano. She looked at Ava. She'd played in front of people before, obviously. She'd performed, she'd accompanied, she'd done recitals through 2 decades of lessons and practice. But she'd also spent 3.5 years not playing in front of anyone. And there was a specific kind of exposure in playing for someone you cared about that was different from playing for an audience. But this was Ava. Sure, she said. Come sit. She pulled the bench out and patted the space beside her. Ava climbed up and sat. Franklin tucked under one arm and looked at the keyboard with the same seriousness she'd brought to the Pancake Kitchen tour. Megan played something simple first, A Chopin nocturne she could do with her eyes closed, something her fingers remembered in their own way. She played it quietly, the way you played things at night when you weren't trying to fill a room with them, just to have them exist. Ava didn't say anything for the whole piece. When it ended, she was quiet for a moment. "That's the saddest thing I've heard since my mom's funeral," she said. Megan went very still. "That's not bad," Ava added quickly. "It's just, there's a kind of sad that feels good, like it makes you feel less alone. That was that kind." Megan looked at the keys. She thought about her father's Gershwin records and about all the ways music held the things people couldn't say directly. "Your mom liked music," she said. "She played violin. She wasn't as good as you, but she loved it more." Ava said it without weight, just remembering. She used to play when she was upset, and it made her less upset. And sometimes I would just sit on the floor outside the door and listen. Outside the door. She needed the room to herself when she played. I understood that. Megan looked at this small person sitting next to her in the lamplight, with her stuffed elephant and her library book and her particular precise way of telling the truth, and felt something so full and so sudden that she had to breathe through it. "Do you want me to play something else?" she said. "Can you play something less sad?" Megan thought. Then she played Clair de Lune, which was technically still melancholy, but had more movement in it, more searching, something that was less about loss and more about looking. Ava listened with her eyes half closed. By the third page, she was leaning slightly against Megan's arm. Not heavily, just resting there. By the final page, she was almost asleep, and Franklin had slid down from under her arm and was listing to one side on the bench. Megan finished the piece, sat in the silence after it. "Megan," Ava said, drowsy. "Yeah. I'm glad Uncle Ethan made us go to that diner." Megan looked at her. "He made you go?" "He'd been going to the same breakfast place for 3 years, and I told him it was boring and I wanted to try somewhere different." Ava's eyes were fully closed now. "He said okay." Megan sat very still with the shape of that information. Ethan hadn't discovered the diner by accident. Ava had pushed for it. Ava, 6 years old and already conducting operations. "Ava," she said softly. "Did you plan that?" A pause. "I like the look of the sign." "You like the look of the sign?" "And the Yelp reviews were good." "You read Yelp reviews?" Uncle Ethan showed me how. A longer pause, the kind that preceded sleep. "I just thought it looked nice. I didn't plan anything." Megan wasn't entirely sure she believed that, but the child was nearly asleep on her shoulder, and the room was quiet, and the piano was warm under her hands, and there was something so fundamentally okay about this moment, the specific rightness of it, that she let the question go. Ethan came back at 9:15. He knocked softly and she let him in and pointed at the living room where Ava was now fully asleep on the couch, with Franklin in her arms and the library book fanned open beside her. He stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at his niece for a moment with that expression Megan had come to know, the one that was made of love and grief and responsibility in roughly equal parts, the expression of someone who had become a parent in the hardest possible way and was still, every day, doing their best with it. He turned back to her. He kept his voice low. "How was she?" "Perfect," Megan said. "She's perfect." He looked at her for a beat too long. "Thank you. Seriously. I played piano for her. She fell asleep in the middle of Debussy. She sleeps through everything." He glanced back at Ava. "I should get her home." "Yeah." He stepped into the living room and crouched beside the couch and gently woke Ava in the practiced way of someone who had learned exactly how much pressure it took to bring a sleeping child back without frightening her. Ava surfaced slowly, gathered Franklin without opening her eyes, and was mostly asleep again by the time Ethan got her jacket on her. At the door, with Ava draped against his shoulder, he looked at Megan. "Dinner," he said. "Next week. The 3 of us, or just us if you want. Either way." She looked at him, at Ava, at the particular picture they made together, the 2 of them framed in her doorway. "Either way works," she said. He nodded. Something in his face had loosened. The way things loosened when a decision had been made and the making of it was a relief. "I'll text you," he said. "Okay." He left. She stood at the door for a moment after she'd closed it, and then walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench where Ava had been sitting, in the residual warmth of it, and placed her hands on the keys without playing. She sat there for a long time. They had dinner the following Thursday. Just the two of them. Ava was at a school overnight, something Ethan had mentioned with the careful nonchalance of someone who understood the significance of what they were saying and wasn't ready to announce it directly. He picked a restaurant in the West Village that was small and not trying to be anything other than what it was. Good food, decent wine, tables close together in the way that forced you into each other's presence, whether you meant to be there or not. Megan wore the blue dress she bought the previous October and hadn't worn because there'd been nowhere particular to wear it. They were both slightly nervous. She could see it in him in the way he looked at the menu too carefully, and she suspected he could see its equivalent in her. The way she was sitting too straight, too composed, performing composure in a way she didn't normally bother with. About 20 minutes in, he put the menu down. "We're being weird," he said. "Little bit," she agreed. "We know each other." "We do." "So." He picked up his wine. "Why is this strange?" "Because it's different," she said. "And we both know it's different, and neither of us has actually said so." He looked at her across the table. "Do you want to say so?" She thought about it. "I think we don't need to say it," she said. "I think it's enough that we both know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, just slightly. An agreement, a settling. The tension in his shoulders shifted. "Okay," he said. "Okay." The food came. They ate and talked the way they'd been talking for months, about his work and her music and the city and the small particular things that had accumulated between them over the winter. But underneath it, there was a new quality to the conversation, something that hadn't been there before, a kind of permission that neither of them had granted explicitly, but both of them were now operating with. He asked about her family. She told him about her parents, her father, the Gershwin records, the particular quiet of a house where music was a value rather than an entertainment. Her mother, who was alive and difficult and living in Cincinnati, and who Megan called every Sunday with the mixture of love and exhaustion that seemed to be the standard arrangement between mothers and daughters. "She doesn't understand what you're doing in New York," he asked. "She understands it fine. She just doesn't think it makes sense. Those are different things. Fair. She wanted me to come home after the audition. She had a whole plan. Teaching at the community music school, a cheaper apartment, a more sensible life." She said it without bitterness. And she wasn't wrong, exactly. She just wanted me to be okay more than she wanted me to be myself. And those conflicted. For a while, yeah. She turned her wine glass by the stem. "I think she understands it better now. She just doesn't say so." "Mothers rarely do." You have experience with this?" He half smiled. "Mine passed away when I was in college, but yes, short experience." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She was... He thought about it. "She was like Ava. She said what she thought, and she didn't apologize for it. It drove me crazy when I was 18. I would give a lot to be able to talk to her now." Megan looked at him. "She'd be proud of you. With Ava. I think she'd be proud." He looked away for a moment. When he looked back, his expression had that particular quality she'd first seen at the diner in October. The slight rawness of someone not accustomed to being seen clearly and not entirely sure what to do about it. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." They stayed until the restaurant was more than half empty. Neither of them was in any particular hurry. They split the bill, he argued. She held firm. They compromised in a way that was slightly absurd and made both of them laugh, and walked out into the April evening. The West Village at 9:30 on a Thursday had its own specific grammar. People at outdoor tables with sweaters over their dinner clothes, the warm light from small restaurants spilling onto the sidewalk, the sound of the city in its quieter register. He walked her toward the subway. They didn't hold hands. They walked close enough that their arms touched occasionally, and nobody made anything of it. At the subway entrance, she turned to say goodnight. He was looking at her with the expression she was starting to understand was the version of him that had stopped managing things, where he let the actual feelings show without intermediary. "This was good," he said. "It was. We should do it again." "We should." He reached out and pushed a piece of her hair back that had come loose from behind her ear in the evening wind. It was a small gesture, careful, and he did it the way people did things when they were not yet sure they had the right to, but had decided to do them anyway. "Good night, Megan," he said. "Good night," she said. She went down the subway steps and didn't look back and stood on the platform with the city moving around her and her heart doing something uncomplicated and enormous in her chest. She thought, "Oh," just that, just the one word, "Oh." May settled over the city like a long exhale. The park became something you went to rather than through. People sat on the grass and didn't explain why. Megan found herself in conversations she hadn't anticipated. About music specifically. Someone who'd heard through someone else that she played piano. A mother at the coffee shop on her block who asked if she knew anyone who gave lessons. She'd given the woman her number without thinking about it. The woman had called 2 days later. Her first student in 4 years was a 7-year-old named Sophie, who couldn't sit still for more than 6 minutes, but had a natural sense of phrase that made Megan catch her breath the first time she heard it. She taught Sophie at her apartment on Saturday mornings. Sophie's mother sat in the kitchen and read and pretended not to listen. Sophie played everything too fast and then, when corrected, too slow, and never quite found the middle until the day she suddenly, without warning, found exactly the middle. And the look on her face when she heard herself play it right for the first time was the specific look Megan had been trying to get back to for 4 years. She texted Ethan afterward without thinking about it. "Had a piano lesson today. First one in forever. Kid was amazing." He texted back within 2 minutes. "Tell me about her." So she did. This was how they had become, by May, texting through their days in the patchwork way of two people whose lives hadn't merged, but whose thinking had started to. She sent him things she found interesting. He sent her articles about nothing in particular. It wasn't romantic in any movie way, it was more intimate than that. It was the intimacy of two people who had started factoring each other into how they saw things. The Tuesdays were still Tuesdays, but everything about them had a different weight now, a different specificity. When he walked through the door, she felt it before she turned around. When he left, she stood for a moment afterward with the warm residue of it. She didn't talk about it. She wasn't ready to examine it out loud. But she'd stopped pretending to herself that it wasn't happening, and that, for Megan Carter, was its own kind of progress. On the last Tuesday of May, Ava came in wearing a different jacket. Not yellow, a light green cotton thing, with small white flowers on the collar. Megan looked at it. "The yellow one has a broken zipper," Ava explained, reading her expression. "We're getting it fixed." "I see. I know it's weird without it." "It's a nice jacket." Ava looked down at it. "I chose it myself," she said. "I needed a new one for a while, but I kept thinking the right one would show up." She smoothed the front of it. And then it did. She said it simply, without any awareness that she might be saying something more than one thing at once. Megan looked at Ethan. He was watching his niece with the expression of a man who was quietly, incrementally, coming back to life. He looked up and caught Megan watching him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. June arrived, and with it the specific kind of heat that settled into Manhattan's stone and didn't leave. The kind that made the subway platforms unbearable by 8 in the morning and turned the sidewalks into something that radiated up through the soles of your shoes. Megan had grown up in Ohio and had never quite made peace with New York summers. But this June she noticed the heat less than she usually did, which she understood was information about her state of mind, even if she didn't spend much time analyzing it. She had 4 piano students by the first week of June. Sophie on Saturdays, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus who had been forced into lessons by his parents and arrived at every session with the expression of someone serving a sentence, a teenage girl named Priya who was genuinely talented and knew it in a way that was more endearing than arrogant, and a woman in her 50s named Carol who had retired from a career in publishing and decided, with the particular decisiveness of people who had spent decades deferring things, that she was finally going to learn. Carol was Megan's favorite to teach, though she would never have said so. She made mistakes with complete equanimity and started over without drama and asked good questions and didn't apologize for not being better than she was. There was a lesson in Carol that Megan was still working out. She'd started keeping a notebook, not a formal thing. A spiral bound from the drugstore that she wrote in at the kitchen table in the mornings before her shifts, working out ideas for how she wanted to structure lessons, what she thought good teaching actually looked like, the difference between technique and feel, and how you bridge the gap between them. The notebook had started as a practical tool and had become something else, a way of thinking on paper that she'd forgotten she needed. She was writing in it one morning when her phone rang. Ethan. "Hey," she said. "Hey, are you working today?" "Not until noon. Why?" "I have something I want to show you." He said it with a specific quality in his voice. Not quite excitement, more like the controlled version of excitement that people managed when they were trying not to oversell something. "If you have time this morning." "What is it?" "I'd rather show you. Can you be ready in an hour?" She looked at the notebook, at the half-finished thought she'd been working through. "Sure," she said. He picked her up in a car, not a cab, his own car, which she'd ridden in only once before when he'd driven her home after a dinner in the rain, and they'd sat in the parked car outside her building for 20 minutes, talking about nothing important. He drove with the same focused efficiency he brought to most things, navigating traffic with minimal drama, taking routes she wouldn't have thought of. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" she asked. "Almost there." They ended up in a neighborhood on the Upper West Side she knew peripherally but not well, one of those pockets of the city that felt residential in a way the grid didn't quite prepare you for. He parked on a side street and walked her around the corner to a brownstone with a ground-floor commercial space. The windows were covered from the inside with brown paper. He had a key. She stood in the doorway of an empty room, good-sized, maybe 800 square feet, wood floors that needed refinishing but were solid, high ceilings, 2 large windows that faced west and would get afternoon light. There was a smaller room off the back that had been used for storage, and a bathroom. The walls were painted a specific shade of off-white that had probably looked fine when it was new and now looked like something that needed replacing. It was empty and slightly dusty and smelled of old wood and city. Megan stood in the middle of it and understood, without him saying so, what he was showing her. "Ethan," she said, "it's for lease, 6 months minimum, renewable." He was watching her with his hands in his pockets, the expression of someone who had thought carefully about something and wasn't certain how it would land. "The owner is a client of mine, or was, few years back. He owes me a conversation. The lease rate is below market." "How far below market?" "Significantly." She looked around the room, at the windows, which were the thing she kept coming back to. Good light. Western exposure. Afternoon sun for the second half of the day. "You found me a studio," she said. "I found you a space. What you do with it is your thing." She turned to look at him. He was still doing the controlled excitement thing, which she had come to understand meant he cared about this more than he was showing. "When did you—" She stopped, started again. "How long have you been looking?" "A few weeks?" He said it carefully. "You mentioned the idea back in April, that you wanted something more structured, more intentional. I pay attention to commercial real estate as part of my work. I saw this and I thought, you thought you'd find me a studio. I thought I'd see if there was something worth showing you." She turned back to the room. She walked to the windows and looked at the paper covering them and then at the floor under her feet, which creaked slightly in a way that suggested the building had personality. "I'd need to run numbers," she said. "Of course. I'd need to think about what the actual program would look like. How many students, whether I'd bring in other teachers eventually. Obviously. And I'd need to talk to the owner myself. About the terms." "I can set that up today if you want." She looked at him. He was watching her with that directness he'd mostly stopped containing. The one that said, "I see you specifically, and I think you can do this, specifically." And she felt the warmth of that down to her feet, but underneath the warmth was something smaller and cooler, something she didn't fully identify in that moment. It's incredibly thoughtful," she said. "I mean that." "But?" "No but. It's thoughtful." He nodded. He seemed to hear something in her voice that she hadn't fully named herself, but he didn't push. "Think about it," he said. "There's no pressure." She nodded. She looked around the room one more time, at the light trying to come through the covered windows, at the floors that needed work but were worth working on. She thought, this is a good thing he did. She believed that. She held it alongside the other thing, the smaller, cooler thing she hadn't named yet, and let them both be true at once. She thought about the studio for 3 days without talking to him about it. She ran the numbers 4 times. She thought about Carol and Sophie and Marcus, who didn't want to be there, and Priya, who absolutely did. She thought about the light in those west-facing windows and the way good light changed the quality of a room and therefore the quality of what happened in it. She thought about the 8-year-old she'd once taught who played ragtime at a recital and looked at the audience afterward like he'd discovered something he was going to keep forever. She said yes on a Thursday. She texted Ethan, "I want to do it. Can you set up the call with the owner?" He texted back, "Already told him to expect your call. His number is in your contacts. I added it last week." She sat with her phone for a moment. He'd added the number last week, before she'd said yes, before she'd run the numbers, before she'd done any of the deliberating she'd spent 3 days on. She thought about that. She didn't say anything about it then. She had a call to make. The owner was a man named Gareth Holloway, direct and efficient, who confirmed the terms, answered her questions without padding, and told her she could have access for a walkthrough with a contractor anytime. He spoke about Ethan with the specific warmth of someone who had once been helped by him in a way they hadn't forgotten. "He's a good man," Gareth said, near the end of the call. "He thinks well of you." Megan said thank you and ended the call and sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand. She thought, "He thinks well of me." She thought, "And he put my future in motion before I'd decided it myself." She put the phone down and opened her notebook and wrote nothing in it for a while. The summer got busy in a way that was different from previous summers, which had been busy in the gray, undifferentiated way of someone putting hours in without a clear direction. This busy had shape to it. She worked her morning shifts at Carver's, she taught her students, she met with a contractor about the studio floors, she started building something in the notebook that looked more and more like a real curriculum. She and Ethan had dinner every week or so, sometimes with Ava and sometimes without. Ava had started the kind of summer where she seemed to be growing visibly between visits, not just physically, but in that more interior way, the thickening of personality that happened in children when they were becoming more specifically themselves. She'd started asking Megan music questions, not basic ones, questions about why certain chords felt a certain way, why some songs made you want to cry even when the words weren't sad, whether it was possible to be bad at music or whether badness was just not yet goodness. "That last one is a real question," she told Megan on a Tuesday in late June. "I know it is." Megan refilled the hot chocolate even though it wasn't empty. "What made you think about it?" "I've been trying to learn the recorder at school, and I'm bad at it." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "I don't know if it's that I'm bad at music or bad at the recorder specifically. What does it sound like when you play?" "Like a bird that's very upset." "Okay, so you're bad at recorder right now." "Right now," Ava repeated, testing the temporal quality of it. "Right now you're bad at recorder. That's not the same as being bad at music. It's not even the same as being permanently bad at recorder." Megan leaned on the counter. "Everything sounds like an upset bird at first. The question is whether you want to stay with it long enough to get to the next part." "What's the next part?" "A slightly less upset bird, and then, eventually, something that actually sounds like music." Ava considered this with appropriate seriousness. "How long does it take?" "Depends on the person. Depends on how often you practice. Depends on whether you're afraid of sounding bad." I'm not afraid of sounding bad," Ava said, with the confidence of someone who genuinely wasn't. "Then you'll probably get there faster than most." Ava nodded like this was the confirmation of a theory she'd already held. She picked up her hot chocolate. "Uncle Ethan can't sing," she said. "He sounds terrible, but he sings anyway." "Does he?" "In the car, when he thinks I'm not paying attention." She smiled into the mug. "He always does the harmonies wrong." Megan looked across the diner to where Ethan was sitting in the booth, reading something on his phone, apparently unaware that his musical limitations were being disclosed. She felt the warmth of it, the specific, domestic, unguarded warmth of knowing this about a person and being told it by someone who loved them. She thought, "I love them, both of them." She let the thought sit. She didn't panic at it. She just let it be there, taking up exactly as much space as it needed. The studio lease started on July 1st. She gave notice at Carver's on June 25th. Not entirely. She negotiated down to 2 morning shifts a week, which the owner agreed to because good counterstaff were hard to find, and she was, after 3.5 years, very good counterstaff. The reduced schedule felt like the right middle. She wasn't ready to let go of the diner completely, partly for the money while the studio got started, and partly because she understood now that Carver's had been more than a job she'd settled for. It had been the place where she'd stopped running, where she'd let herself be found. She wasn't sentimental about it exactly, but she also wasn't ready to walk away. The studio's first real day, the floors refinished, the walls repainted, a second-hand upright piano installed in the main room and a smaller keyboard set up in the back, was a Saturday in the second week of July. She'd planned it practically. Sophie at 10, Marcus at 11, Priya at noon, Carol at 1. A full morning into early afternoon. She'd told herself to expect the unexpected, to be patient with the logistics, to not overinvest in the first day being anything other than a start. But when Sophie sat down at the new piano and touched the first key and looked around at the room with its afternoon light and its high ceiling and its new smell of wood and fresh paint, Megan felt something that she recognized as the thing she'd been trying to get back to for 4 years. Not quite joy, or not only joy. Something wider than that. Something that felt like being in the right place, doing the right thing for the first time in longer than she wanted to count. Ethan brought Ava by in the early afternoon, after her last lesson had finished. He'd asked permission, texted that morning, "Can we come see it?" Ava's been asking. She'd texted back, "Come after 1, bring something to celebrate." He brought sparkling cider, thoughtful, because Ava, and a bakery box with 3 small cakes in it, one of which Ava had clearly chosen because it had pink frosting and a small edible star on top. Ava walked into the studio and stood in the main room and turned around once, slowly, taking it in. "This is exactly right," she said. "What does that mean, exactly right?" Ethan asked. "It looks like music." She said it simply. "Some places do and some places don't." Megan looked at Ethan. He raised his eyebrows slightly in the way he did when Ava said something that landed harder than expected. They sat on the floor because there wasn't enough furniture yet. 3 people and a bakery box and sparkling cider in plastic cups. And they ate cake in the afternoon light, while Ava described in precise detail the proper technique for consuming a cake with pink frosting in a way that preserved the star for last. "For good luck," she explained. "I didn't know that was a rule," Ethan said. "It's not a rule, it's a practice." "What's the difference?" "Rules you have to follow. Practices you choose to." Megan ate her cake and watched the two of them. Ethan tolerating Ava's guidance about the frosting with patient affection, Ava deeply invested in the proper procedure, and thought, "This is what I was afraid to want. This ordinary, slightly imperfect, completely real thing." 3 people on the floor of a music studio eating cake out of a box. "Thank you for this," she said to Ethan, quietly, while Ava was examining her star with the focus it deserved. He looked at her. He knew she meant the studio, the introduction to Gareth, the lease rate, all of it. He also knew, she thought, that she meant something wider than that. "It was the right thing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her. Not the warm thing, or not only that. The smaller, cooler thing was still there, still unnamed, waiting. But it was a celebration. She let it be a celebration. July was good. She would think about that afterward, in the way people thought about good periods when they could see what came after them. July was genuinely good. She was doing the work she should have been doing for years. She was building something. The students were responding, and the quality of the hours had changed in the specific way hours changed when they were being spent on something that mattered. She and Ethan settled into a rhythm that had the comfortable familiarity of something longer standing. Dinner once a week, usually. The park on Sundays when schedules allowed. The texting that happened in the in-between. The checking in and the passing of small observations that were really just 2 people saying, "I'm thinking of you. I thought you'd want to know." He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late July. They were on the sidewalk outside her building after dinner, and it had been coming for a while, the way things came when they'd been circling each other long enough. He'd reached out and held her face with both hands and looked at her for a moment with the expression that showed up when he'd stopped managing things. And then he kissed her, and it wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was just warm and careful, and it lasted long enough to be real. When he pulled back, she looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. He went home. She went inside. She stood in her apartment for a while with her coat still on, and then she sat at the piano and played until midnight, which was, she understood, her way of feeling things all the way through. August arrived, and the city did what it always did in August. It became slightly frantic in the particular way of a place that knew the summer was ending and hadn't finished with it yet. Megan added 2 new students. Ethan's firm closed a deal he'd been working on since winter, which meant a week of late nights and distracted texts, and one dinner that ended at 8:30 because he was exhausted and honest about it. She was learning the textures of him, the way he went quiet when something was genuinely worrying him versus the way he went quiet when he was just thinking. The way he asked for things obliquely, as requests that were technically optional, because directness about his own needs was the thing he found hardest. The way he laughed, reluctantly and then fully, like it surprised him every time. She was learning herself in relation to him, which was its own education. She was less good at asking for things than she'd thought. She was more private than she'd realized, more accustomed to keeping her interior life separate from whoever she was with. She'd thought of herself as open, but what she'd been was available, which was different. Available meant you showed up. Open meant you let people see the complicated stuff, the unresolved stuff, the things you were still working out. She was trying to be more open. She didn't always manage it. They were lying on a blanket in Central Park on a Sunday in mid-August. Ava asleep between them with her head on Ethan's jacket and Franklin tucked under her arm, and the park was doing its late summer thing of being impossibly beautiful and completely indifferent to how temporary it was. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. He was looking at the sky. "Okay." "About the studio." He paused. "Have you thought about where you want it to go, long term?" "Some. Yeah." She'd been thinking about it a lot, actually, whether to stay at the current location or eventually find something larger, whether to bring in another teacher or keep it intimate, what age range she most wanted to work with. "I'm still figuring out the shape of it." "Have you thought about Ava taking lessons there?" She turned her head to look at him. He was still looking at the sky, which was the tell. "She'd be a great student," Megan said. "Has she asked?" She mentioned it. "I didn't want to assume. She can come anytime she wants. She doesn't have to ask." Ethan nodded. He turned his head to look at her. "She loves you," he said. "Matter of fact, just putting it in the air between them." "I love her too." He looked at her for a moment, something in his expression doing the complicated thing it did when he was about to say something he'd been sitting with for a while. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what this looks like, going forward, the 3 of us. Ethan, I'm not trying to make it into something it's not ready to be. He stopped, looked at the sky again. "I think about it, about what would make sense, what would be good for her, what would be good for both of us." Megan was quiet. "That's a lot of thinking on my behalf," she said. She said it lightly, but there was something underneath it. "Yeah, I'm still here." He looked at her. "I know. He stopped again, and she could see him deciding whether to say the rest of it. "I have a tendency to plan, to try to see the full picture before other people have had a chance to weigh in on it. My therapist calls it control. I call it preparation." "Your therapist is correct." He half smiled. "Probably." She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the park, the late summer gold that made everything look like it was already being remembered. Ava was breathing slowly between them. "When you think about it," she said, "about what this looks like going forward, are you thinking with me or are you thinking for me?" The question landed. She could see it land. He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "That's a fair question. I'm not saying I don't want to think about it. I do. I just want to be in the thinking." "Yeah," he said. "I hear you." She let it rest there. The park went on. A group of teenagers played music from a speaker somewhere nearby, something with too much bass, which made Ava stir slightly and then settle. Megan thought, he heard it. He said he heard it. And she believed him because in every interaction she'd had with him over 9 months, Ethan Sterling had been exactly as good as his word. She let it rest. It was a conversation at dinner in the first week of September that cracked something open. They were at a restaurant in Midtown. His choice, nicer than usual, one of those places with cloth napkins that got refolded if you stepped away from the table. She'd wondered, getting dressed, whether there was a reason for the upgrade, but she'd chalked it up to the deal closing and told herself she was reading into things. They were between the first course and the second when he said, "I've been talking to a realtor." She set her fork down. "About what?" she said, though she'd already felt the shape of where this was going. "About the Upper West Side, mostly." He said it steadily, watching her. "About neighborhoods? School districts? About what it would look like to—" He stopped, chose his words. "To consolidate, to make something that made practical sense." "To consolidate," she repeated. "That's the wrong word. What's the right word?" "I've been thinking about what it would look like if we—" He stopped again. She watched him navigate the space between what he meant and how to say it. "If the three of us were in one place." The restaurant went on around them. Someone laughed at a nearby table. A waiter moved past with a tray. Megan was quiet for a long moment. "When did you start talking to the realtor?" she said. "A few weeks ago. Before or after we talked in the park? About being in the thinking together?" He recognized what she was asking. She could see it. "Before," he said. "And after?" He was quiet. "Did you keep talking to them after?" she said. "Yes." She picked up her water glass and set it down without drinking from it. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands, which were very still. "I should have said something," he said. "I know that." "Tell me what you were thinking," she said. "Not what you should have done. What you were actually thinking." He exhaled, looked at the table and then back at her. "I was thinking that you were spending money on studio rent, and I was paying for a 4-bedroom apartment that was always going to be too big, and that there was an obvious solution, and that if I found the right option, if I made it easy, concrete, you might be more open to it than if it was just an abstract conversation." She sat with that. "You were trying to make it easy for me," she said. "Yes. By deciding the shape of it before you told me." A pause. "Yes." She looked at him. At the careful, controlled man across the table who thought well and planned meticulously, and whose deepest habit, she understood now, was solving problems before the people affected by them had a chance to participate. "You found the studio for me," she said. "That was different, was it?" She wasn't angry. She was something more complicated than angry. "You found the studio before I'd decided I wanted it. You added Gareth's number to my phone before I'd said yes. And now you've been talking to a realtor about where we might all live before you'd had the actual conversation with me." He didn't argue with the framing. She respected that. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I know you did. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if I could show you what it could look like, you'd see that it was good, that it made sense. And if I'd said no, after you'd already talked to the realtor, after you'd already found the place?" He didn't answer that, because there wasn't a good answer. "Ethan," she said his name carefully. "I know your intentions were good. I believe that completely. But you made decisions about my future without asking me first. And you kept making them after I told you I wanted to be in the thinking. I hear you." "No." The word came out more firmly than she'd planned. "I need you to hear me past the point where you manage it." She stopped, made herself slow down. "I spent a long time being someone who folded when things got hard, who let fear make my decisions. I'm not doing that anymore. But I also can't be with someone who makes the decisions for me, even with the best intentions, because I can't tell the difference from the inside. I can't tell if I'm being loved or managed." The table between them was very quiet. "That's not what I was doing," he said. "I know you don't think it was." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen before, not anger, not defense, but something raw, something that looked like recognition, like he was seeing himself from the outside and not entirely liking the view. "I do this," he said, slowly. "I do this with companies. I come in and I see the problem and I solve it before anyone gets hurt. And sometimes that's the right thing, but sometimes it means the people who are part of the problem don't get to be part of the solution." "Yes," she said, "that." He was quiet for a long time. The restaurant went on. A couple at the next table ordered dessert. "I don't know how to not do it," he said finally. I don't mean that as an excuse. I don't know another way of being useful. Useful isn't the same as right, she said. And I don't need you to be useful. I need you to be honest with me. To ask me what I want before you've already decided what that is. He nodded. She could see him taking it in, not deflecting, not defending, sitting with it. I'm sorry, he said. I mean that. I know you do. She did know. That wasn't the problem. That had never been the problem. They finished dinner in a way that was careful and honest and not comfortable. He drove her home, and she let him, and they sat in the parked car outside her building in the September night, which was their specific place for conversations that didn't have clean endings. I need some time to think, she said. He looked at her. How much time? I don't know. I'm not ending anything. I'm just not ready to move forward until I've processed this. He nodded. She could see what it cost him to not say more, to not find the angle that would fix this in the parking spot in the next 10 minutes. Okay, he said. She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk and he lowered the window and looked at her with the expression she'd cataloged months ago, the one that meant he'd stopped managing things, where the actual feeling showed through. She wanted to say something that would make it less painful. She didn't. I'll call you, she said. She went inside. She sat at the piano for a long time that night. She didn't play. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the shape of what had happened. She thought about the studio, about Gareth's number already in her phone, about the realtor who'd been contacted before she'd been consulted, about the pattern underneath those specific events. She thought, he loves me. She was certain of that. And she thought, love isn't enough if the shape of it makes you invisible. She thought about her own patterns too, the way she'd felt in the park and in other moments, that small, cool thing she'd never named. She named it now. It was the feeling of being a problem someone was solving, of being handled, however gently and however well, of having the dimensions of her life measured from the outside before she'd measured them herself. It wasn't what he'd intended, she knew that, but intention and impact were different problems, and she'd learned enough about herself in the past 9 months to know that she couldn't paper over impact with intention. Not anymore. Not after all the work she'd done to stop being the kind of person who folded. She put her hands on the keys. She played a chord. She held it. She thought about Ava, about the yellow rain jacket with the broken zipper, the new green one with the white flowers that the child had chosen herself when she was ready. I kept thinking the right one would show up. And then it did. She played another chord. She thought, the love is real. Everything that happened between July and tonight is real. And this is also real. This thing that I can't let go of. This need to be someone who participates in her own life. She thought, I don't know whether those two real things can exist in the same future. She played until 2 a.m, not any specific piece, just sounds, progressions, the musical equivalent of pacing, trying to find her way through something that didn't have a clear harmonic resolution, that was going to sit in dissonance for a while, whether she was ready for it or not. When she finally stopped, the apartment was very quiet. She sat in the silence after the sound. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, always moving, not waiting, never waiting. She sat still in the middle of it and held the two things that were both true at once and understood that she was going to have to figure out, probably not tonight, which truth was bigger, and whether big enough was enough. She didn't call him for 11 days. She hadn't planned on 11. She told herself a few days, enough to let the sediment settle, enough to see clearly once the immediate emotional charge had moved through her. But the few days became a week, and the week became more than a week. And each morning she woke up and thought, today? And then didn't. It wasn't that she was punishing him. She was clear-eyed enough about herself to know the difference between distance as punishment and distance as necessity. This was necessity. She needed the room to hear herself think without the weight of his presence in the thinking, without the specific gravity of him that had, she was realizing, been shaping the contours of her days for longer than she'd tracked. She kept her shifts at Carver's. She taught her students. Sophie was making real progress. Her right hand had developed a consistency that hadn't been there 2 months ago, and she'd started listening to herself play, which was the actual skill underneath all the other skills. Marcus had stopped looking like he was serving a sentence and now looked merely neutral, which Megan considered a victory. Priya was learning a Beethoven sonata that was slightly above her current level, which Megan had assigned on purpose because Priya needed the friction of something hard and the specific education of being humbled by something she'd assumed she could manage. Carol was the one who asked. She came on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of September and sat down at the piano and played the first page of the Schumann piece she'd been working on, cleaner than the previous week, more inside the rhythm, and then stopped and looked at Megan with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 35 years editing manuscripts and had learned to see when something wasn't being said. "Something's different with you," she said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said something's different." Megan stood with her arms crossed and looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then at Carol. "I'm dealing with something. It's not about you or your lesson." "I know it's not about my lesson." Carol folded her hands in her lap. "Do you want to talk about it? Or do you want me to play scales while you collect yourself?" Megan almost laughed. "You don't have to play scales." "Then talk." She wasn't sure why she did. Maybe because Carol was the least invested in the outcome, the person with the least skin in the game, the one who would listen without needing the story to go a particular direction. Or maybe because 11 days of silence had built up a pressure that needed somewhere to go, and Carol's steady, unsentimental presence was the right container for it. She gave her the shape of it, not the details. She kept the details for herself. But the shape. A relationship she'd let herself want after a long time of not letting herself want things. Someone who cared about her genuinely. Someone who also had a habit of solving things on her behalf before asking if she wanted them solved. The dinner in Midtown. The realtor. Carol listened without interrupting, which was its own skill. When Megan finished, Carol was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And you'll tell me honestly if it's too direct?" "Go ahead." "Are you more upset that he did it, or that he kept doing it after you told him not to?" Megan thought about it. "Both, but the second one more." "Why?" "Because the first one I could explain. He's someone who solves things. That's how his brain works." "I understand that." She stopped. "The second one means he heard me and kept going anyway, and I can't tell whether that's arrogance or fear. Whether he was doing it because he thought he knew better, or because the idea of not having a plan made him too anxious to stop." Carol nodded slowly. "And the difference matters to you, doesn't it?" "Yes," Carol said. "I think it does." She looked at the piano keys for a moment. "My husband used to do something similar. He was a planner. He had every vacation mapped out 6 months ahead, every decision analyzed from every angle before it was made. For the first 10 years of our marriage, I thought it was about control, about needing to be the one who ran things." "Was it?" "No." She touched a key without pressing it. "It was about terror. He grew up in a house where things fell apart without warning. His way of managing that was to plan everything so thoroughly that nothing could surprise him." She looked up at Megan. "He wasn't trying to run my life. He was trying to keep his fear from running his." Megan sat with that. "That doesn't mean it's okay," Carol said. "I'm not saying that. It took us years and several difficult conversations to actually fix it. I'm just saying the question of why matters, because the why determines whether it can change." Megan looked at the floor. "I know why," she said. "I think I've known for a while." "It doesn't make it easier." "No," Carol said. "Understanding someone rarely makes things easier. It just makes them more honest." She picked up the Schumann and started playing. Megan stood in the afternoon light of the studio and listened to the music and thought about fear, his kind and her own kind, and the various ways people built their defenses and then lived inside them and called the defenses something else. "Want." Ava texted her on day 9. The text was brief and characteristic. "You haven't been at the diner on Tuesdays. We went twice and you weren't there." Megan sat with her phone for a long time. Then she texted back, "I know, I'm sorry, I'm dealing with some things. Tell me about your week." Ava texted back a detailed account of something that had happened in her math class involving a wrong answer that turned out to be right under a different interpretation, which took 4 messages to fully convey and contained at least 2 moments that made Megan laugh out loud in her empty apartment. Then, after the math story, one more text. "Are you and Uncle Ethan okay?" Megan sat with that one for longer. She texted, "We're figuring some things out. It's okay." Ava texted back, "Okay." And then, a minute later, he's been quiet. Megan put her phone face down on the table. She looked at the piano. She thought, he's been quiet. She knew what that meant because she'd spent 9 months learning what Ethan's quiet meant. The different textures of it, which were thinking quiet and hurting quiet and holding himself together quiet. She could have been more specific than that, but she stopped herself. She thought, 11 days is a long time to be quiet. She thought, I'm not ready. And then, but I need to be honest with myself about whether I'm not ready or whether I'm afraid. She'd told him, at the restaurant, I can't be with someone who makes the decisions for me. She'd meant it. She still meant it. She'd also told him, months ago in the park, leaning against his arm while Ava slept between them. I love them. Both of them. She'd meant that too. She was starting to understand that the truth was not going to resolve itself into something clean. She was going to have to walk into it while it was still complicated and deal with the complications directly, which was the thing she'd been most afraid of for most of her adult life. Not the grand gestures, the ordinary, intimate, unglamorous work of being in a real relationship with a real person who had real flaws that intersected badly with her real flaws, in specific ways that required attention. She'd been good at leaving things before they got to that part. She was recognizing that now with a clarity that was uncomfortable. She picked her phone back up. She didn't text Ethan, not yet. She needed one more day. She gave herself one more day. Whoa. She called him on a Tuesday morning, not because Tuesday had symbolic meaning, or not only that, but because Tuesday was the day the three of them had built their whole particular story around, and she thought that mattered, even if only to her. He answered on the second ring. Hey, he said. Just that. Just the word, with nothing performed in it, no careful neutrality, no managed distance. Just his voice, slightly rough at the edges, and the single syllable that meant, I'm here. Can we talk? She said. Yes. No hesitation. Where? She thought about the options. His apartment, her apartment, the restaurant, the park. She thought about all the places they'd had important conversations and where they'd each felt most and least like themselves. The diner, she said. A pause on the line. Okay, he said, when? Now, if you can. I can be there in 20 minutes. She was already in her jacket. Carver's at 10 in the morning had the specific quality she'd always thought of as its truest self. Past the rush, settled into its own rhythm, the light coming through the windows in the particular way it came in October, which was different from every other month, lower and more specific, landing on the black and white tile floor in rectangles that Ava had once described as doors for something small. She got there first. She sat at the counter instead of a booth, not intentionally, just because it was where she'd been standing when she had her best thoughts about her life, and it felt right. She ordered coffee she didn't need and held the cup and looked out the window at the October street. He came in 12 minutes after she'd sat down. She heard the bell and felt him before she turned. That particular awareness she'd had since October of last year, the way a room changed when he was in it. She turned and he was there, in a jacket she'd seen 100 times. And he looked the way he always looked when he'd stopped managing things, undone around the edges, present. He sat down next to her at the counter, not across from her, next to her, facing the same direction, looking out at the same thing, which felt right in a way she hadn't anticipated. Hey, she said. Hey. Joe appeared from the kitchen, registered both of them with a nod that contained exactly the right amount of acknowledgement and exactly zero curiosity, and disappeared again. They sat for a moment. The coffee was in her hands. Outside, a couple walked by with a stroller, the baby asleep, the parents talking to each other with the slightly exhausted ease of people who'd been through something and were on the other side of it. I need to say something first, Ethan said. Okay, and I need to say it without you, without thinking about how you're going to respond to it while I'm saying it, because that's what I do. I think about outcomes while I'm still in the middle of the input, and it makes me bad at this. He stopped. So just let me say it and then you can say whatever you want. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the counter, his hands wrapped around the coffee Joe had set in front of him, and his jaw had the set it got when he was doing something that cost him. I have been managing you, he said, not intentionally, and not because I don't respect you. I respect you completely. That's not the issue. He stopped again. The issue is that when I love something, I try to protect it. I try to build walls around it. I did it with Ava after the accident. I had plans for every contingency, schedules, backup schedules, therapists lined up before she even knew she needed one. And she needed all of those things, but she also needed me to just sit on the couch with her and look at photos and let it be bad for a while without me fixing it. He looked up, met her eyes. I found the studio before you asked me to. I added Gareth's number before you'd decided. I talked to the realtor before we'd had the conversation. And after you told me in the park that you wanted to be in the thinking, I kept going. Not because I didn't hear you, because I heard you, and I was afraid that if I stopped planning, I wouldn't know what to do with my hands. He exhaled. That's the truth. That's the actual thing underneath it. Megan looked at him. She thought about what Carol had said. It took us years and several difficult conversations to actually fix it. She thought about the Ethan who had been named guardian of a 6-year-old girl and had spent the better part of a year constructing elaborate scaffolding around that grief, trying to hold the shape of things until the grief subsided enough to breathe. She thought about herself, about the 4 years of making herself small, of covering the piano, of filling days with tasks that didn't require her to be present, about the specific cowardice she'd given different names to over the years. Control and avoidance were different looking, but they came from the same root. I know why you do it, she said. I know you do. That's not the point. No, the point is that it has to stop. She said it without heat. Not because I don't understand it, because I can't be in a partnership where one person is already 3 steps ahead deciding what the partnership needs. I've spent a long time letting other people, or just the loudest fear in my own head, make decisions about my life. I'm done with that. And I need whoever I'm with to be done with it too. He nodded. Not the quick nod of someone absorbing information and moving past it. The slower nod of someone taking something in at depth. I know, he said. And I need you to understand something about me, she said. Because this isn't only about what you did wrong. She looked at the counter, then back at him. I walked away. That's what I do when things get hard and I don't know what to do with the hardness. I leave space between me and the difficult thing and I call it thinking, but sometimes it's just leaving. She paused. 11 days was too long. I knew by day 4 that I understood what happened and what I needed to say about it. The other 7 days were me being afraid. Of what? She thought about it honestly. Of needing someone and having them not be what I need them to be, of wanting this, us, Ava, everything, and then losing it. I've lost enough things. I got careful about wanting more of them. He looked at her for a long moment. That's fair, he said. That's the same fear, actually, just in a different body. I know, she said. I've been thinking about that. They sat with it for a moment. The diner held them. Outside, October did what October did. The particular golden melancholy of a season that knew it was leaving and made no apologies. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. The realtor. What did you find? He looked slightly surprised. A brownstone on West 86th, ground floor commercial, which I thought could work for the studio if you wanted to move it. 3 floors above. Enough space. He said it carefully, watching her. It's probably too much. Probably, she said. But tell me about it anyway. He did. The details came out carefully, without the push of someone selling something, more like someone describing a thought they'd had and weren't sure how to offer. The layout, the light, the school district, the fact that the building had been in one family for 40 years and the owners were particular about who they sold to. She listened. When he finished, she said, if we ever talk about something like that, and I'm not saying we should, I'm saying if I want to be in that conversation from the beginning, not presented with a solution, in the actual thinking. Yes, he said, that's what I should have done. And I want to be able to say no, or not yet, or I need more time. Yes. And I need you to believe that the not yet doesn't mean no. It just means I'm still figuring out my own dimensions and I need the room to do that. He was looking at her with the particular intensity of someone who was listening beyond the words. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Joe appeared from this kitchen with the coffee pot without being asked and refilled both their cups and said, You two want some breakfast, or are you going to keep talking at my counter all morning? He said it without malice, just the pragmatic inquiry of a man who had watched these two people sit in his diner for a year. Toast, Megan said. Same, Ethan said. Joe disappeared. They looked at each other. Something had shifted, not resolved. It wasn't the kind of thing that resolved in a single conversation. But the quality of the air between them had changed. There was less pressure in it, less management, more of the thing that had been there from the beginning, underneath all the complication. Two people who had found each other at a specific moment in their specific lives and recognized, without being able to articulate why, that the finding was not accidental. I missed you, he said. Not smoothly, just directly. I missed you too. Ava's been... I know, she texted me. He looked slightly alarmed. What did she say? She told me about her math class, and then she said you'd been quiet. He exhaled. She observes everything. She always has. The toast came. They ate without hurrying. The diner moved around them in its Tuesday morning way, and Megan sat at the counter where she'd stood 1,000 times and felt the particular texture of the moment, imperfect, a little ragged around the edges. Not resolved, but real, genuinely real, both of them still a little raw and present inside it. They had a different kind of dinner 3 days later. Not at a restaurant, at her apartment, which was its own shift. She cooked the roasted tomato pasta again, the same thing she'd made for Ava when she'd babysat that first time, and he brought wine and they sat at her small kitchen table and ate without any agenda except eating and talking. He told her things he hadn't told her. About the period after the accident, the week he'd spent in Ava's parents' house going through their things, the specific terror of signing documents that made him responsible for a child's entire life. The night he'd sat in his car outside the house for an hour because he hadn't been ready to go back in. About the therapist he'd started seeing, which he mentioned matter-of-factly in the way that surprised her, and then didn't, because he was someone who solved problems, and going to therapy was a form of problem-solving. What does she say? Megan asked. About the planning, the control. She calls it anticipatory grief management. He drank his wine. She says I've spent so much of my life managing loss before it happens that I've made a career out of it, literally. She's not wrong. She's very much not wrong. He turned his wine glass by the stem, which was something she'd started doing too, she realized. Osmosis. She also says I use the planning as a substitute for presence, that if I'm 3 steps ahead of something, I don't have to be actually inside it. That sounds right too. Yeah. He looked at the table. It's not a fun thing to have confirmed by a professional. No, but it's better than not knowing. He looked at her. You ever see anyone, professionally? For a while, after my dad, and then again for a year in my late 20s when I was not doing great. She said it honestly, without dressing it up. It helped. I stopped going when I started to feel better and then felt slightly worse without it for a few months before I leveled out. The usual. Would you go back? I've thought about it. Maybe. He nodded. It might be. If you wanted, we could both be doing the work at the same time. Not together necessarily, but that's actually not a bad idea, she said. I'm not managing. I'm genuinely asking. I know the difference, she said. You should trust that I know the difference. He looked at her for a moment. You're right, I should. After dinner, they sat on the couch and she put music on low. The Ravel she'd been listening to lately, the one that sounded like water, and they talked and didn't talk in the easy alternation of two people who no longer needed to fill all the silences. At some point, she was leaning against him with his arm around her shoulders, and the city was dark outside the window and the piano was across the room, uncovered, the keys catching the light. Can I ask you something? He said. You've been asking a lot of questions lately. I'm practicing. She looked up at him. Practicing what? Asking instead of deciding. He met her eyes. Can I ask you something? Yes. The studio. What does the next year look like for it? What do you want? She felt the difference immediately. The asking, the actual openness of it, the absence of a plan already waiting behind the question. She told him. The curriculum she'd been building in the notebook. The idea of adding a second teacher in the spring, someone who worked in a different style, to expand what the studio could offer. Eventually, a recital, Not a formal one, not the kind that performed for parents in the way that turned music into evaluation, but something more like a gathering, a sharing. She wanted the students to play for each other, to hear each other, to understand that music was not a competition. He listened. He asked questions. He didn't offer solutions or identify problems. He just followed her thinking wherever it went, and the experience of being followed, genuinely followed, without agenda, was something she felt in her chest like the resolution of a chord that had been suspended for a long time. "You're good at this," he said, "knowing what you want." "I'm getting better at it." "No, you've always known. You just got out of the habit of saying it." She thought about that, about the girl in Cincinnati who listened to Gershwin records and was certain she was going to do something with it, about the years she'd spent narrowing herself down to something manageable. About October a year ago, a bell above a door, a small girl in a yellow rain jacket deciding with absolute confidence that Megan Carter was exactly who she'd been looking for. "Maybe," she said. Say, the conversation with Ava happened on a Sunday in the park, about a week after the Tuesday at Carver's. Ethan had gone to get coffee from a cart near the path entrance, and Ava had remained on the bench with the particular deliberateness of someone who had engineered a situation and was prepared to use it. She looked at Megan with those clear, evaluating eyes. "Are you and Uncle Ethan okay now?" she said. "We're working on it," Megan said, "which is different from not okay." Ava considered this. "Is it my fault?" Megan looked at her. "What? No. Why would it be your fault?" "Because I'm the one who makes things complicated." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact she'd apparently been sitting with. "Uncle Ethan worries about me a lot, and that makes him do things differently than he would if it was just him. I heard you at dinner once, in the spring. You said he thinks for you instead of with you." Megan went very still. "You heard that?" "I wasn't eavesdropping. You were in the kitchen and I was in the hallway." She paused. "Okay, I was a little eavesdropping, but I didn't mean to be." "Ava," Megan turned to face her fully on the bench. "None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? The way your uncle is. The planning, the needing to fix things. That was there long before you needed him. You didn't create it. You didn't make it worse." Ava was quiet for a moment. "He's scared," she said. "I know. He was scared when my mom and dad died. He didn't show it, but I could tell. He went very still, the way he goes when he's scared." Megan thought about Ethan sitting in his car outside the house for an hour because he hadn't been ready to go back in. "Yeah," she said softly. "He was scared." "He loves you," Ava said, matter of fact. "He doesn't say it. To me, I mean. But I can tell. He goes still in a different way when you're there. A good different." She looked at the path where Ethan would come back. He went still in the bad way for the past 2 weeks. Megan sat with that for a moment. "Ava," she said carefully, "you know that whatever happens between me and your uncle, you and I are okay. That doesn't change." Ava looked at her. "Promise?" It was the first time she'd heard Ava ask for a promise. The word landed with the weight of everything it carried. What the child had already learned about promises, about things changing without warning, about the unreliability of even the things you were most sure of. "I promise," Megan said. Ava nodded. She seemed to take it at face value, which was itself a kind of trust that Megan felt the full weight of. When Ethan came back with the coffee, he found them sitting closer together on the bench than they'd been before, Ava leaning slightly against Megan's arm. He looked at them both, and something in his face settled in the way it settled when things were, however imperfectly, okay. "What did I miss?" he said. "We were talking," Ava said. "About?" "Things." She reached for the hot chocolate he'd brought her. "You know, life." He sat down on Ava's other side. He looked at Megan over the top of Ava's head, and she looked back at him. And between them was the complicated, necessary, still not finished work of two people trying to be honest with each other. But also the park in October, the three of them on a bench, the particular warmth of being somewhere you'd chosen to be. Both of those things at once. October moved through its days. Megan went back to Carver's on Tuesdays, and the Tuesday after that, and the following week, Ethan and Ava came in for the first time since the gap, and Ava went directly to the counter and climbed onto her stool and looked at Megan with the expression of someone who had returned from a trip and was relieved to find things where they'd left them. "Hot chocolate," she said. "I know." Megan said. She made it with the cocoa powder and the cream and the marshmallow she had ready before Ava had even sat down, because some things didn't need to be rebuilt. They'd just been waiting. Ethan sat across from her, not at the booth, but at the counter, the way he did on Thursday mornings, and drank his coffee and watched Megan work and didn't try to fill all the space between them with words. He'd been learning that. She could see it in him, the active practice of it, the way he sat with the quiet instead of immediately constructing something inside it. She appreciated the effort. She told him so once in a text that she sent late on a Tuesday night. "I notice you're trying. I want you to know I see it." He texted back, "Thank you for saying so. I notice you're still here. I want you to know I don't take that for granted." She had read that text 4 times. The moment she understood something essential about herself happened on an ordinary Wednesday, between the 11 o'clock and noon lessons, when she was sitting at the studio piano working through a Bach prelude that she'd been returning to lately for no particular reason, except that Bach was what she went to when she needed to think. She was playing the prelude, the C major one, the simplest thing, the one every student learned and almost no one truly heard because they learned it too early and stopped listening to it. And somewhere in the middle of it, she stopped playing and sat in the silence and understood something. She'd been afraid that wanting things was what got people hurt. That was the core of it, the thing she'd been organizing her life around since the audition, since before the audition, since her father died maybe, or since even before that. She'd learned somewhere that the wanting was the dangerous part, that if you reduced your wants down to something small and manageable, the loss of them was survivable. But the thing was, the reduction hadn't actually protected her. It had just meant she'd spent 4 years mourning things she'd given up voluntarily, which was a grief she couldn't even name properly because it didn't have a cause she could point to. She'd covered a piano for 8 months, not because she'd been hurt by music, but because she'd been afraid of being hurt again. And in covering it, she'd hurt herself more thoroughly than any rejection could have. She thought, "I have been protecting myself from a life I was already living." She thought, "I think I've known this for a while," and kept finding ways not to look at it directly. She played the prelude again, all the way through, and in the playing of it, something she'd played hundreds of times, something requiring nothing new from her technically, she felt the thing she'd been trying to get back to for 4 years. Not joy exactly, bigger than joy, more like permission, like she'd stopped standing outside her own life waiting for the right moment to go in. She thought about Ethan, about the realtor conversation, which had been a betrayal of her trust in a specific and real way, and about the man who had been honest about why he'd done it and was, imperfectly and visibly, trying to change the pattern. She thought about the fact that she could see the trying, which meant she could see him, not the managed version, not the controlled exterior, but the actual person doing the actual work of being less afraid. She thought, "I have been holding the mistake against him as a way of not having to be brave enough to go forward." That was uncomfortable to think. She thought it anyway. She finished the prelude. She sat in the afterword of it. She picked up her phone. She texted Ethan, "Are you free Saturday?" He texted back in under a minute. "Yes. What do you need?" She typed and deleted 3 different responses. Then she typed, "Not a need, a want. I want to spend the day with you and Ava if that works." A pause, longer than his usual response time. Then, "It works. It absolutely works." She put the phone down. She put her hands on the piano. She played the Bach again from the beginning and let it be simple and sufficient, which it was. Saturday was the kind of October day that New York occasionally produced as if to remind people why they stayed. Clear, cool, the light specific and gold, the city in its best register. They went to the park first, then lunch at a Thai place near the museum where Ava narrated the aquarium fish with the same authority she'd brought to every subject since Megan had first known her. In the afternoon, they ended up at the studio. Ava had been asking about her first lesson for 2 weeks, and Megan had said Saturday, and so Saturday it was. Ethan sat in the back room with his laptop because he'd brought work and had learned by now that Ava's lessons were not spectator events. She concentrated better without an audience. Megan sat next to Ava on the bench, and they started with the simplest thing, the shape of the hand, the weight of the fingers, what the keys felt like before they made any sound. Ava had the patience for this that she didn't always have for things she considered less interesting, which meant the piano had already done something to her before a note was played. When she played her first chord, a C major, 3 notes, the beginning of everything, she looked up at Megan with the expression Megan recognized from other students, the specific wonder of making a sound that had never existed before in that precise configuration, in that precise moment, from exactly those hands. It felt different than I expected, Ava said. How did you expect it to feel? More like pushing. This felt more like asking. Megan looked at her. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. In the back room, through the open door, she could hear Ethan stop typing. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the keys and let Ava ask them a second question. But she was smiling. The thing about rebuilding trust was that it didn't announce itself. There was no single morning when Megan woke up and felt it click into place. No conversation that ended with everything resolved and accounted for. It happened the way the seasons happened in New York. Gradually and then undeniably, in the accumulation of small evidence until one day you looked around and understood that something had changed without your having witnessed the exact moment of change. November came in cold and definite. The studio had 7 students by the first week of the month, and Megan had started preliminary conversations with a young musician named Daniel, a Juilliard graduate who had been doing session work and teaching privately and was looking for something with more structure, about joining in the new year. He came by on a Tuesday afternoon and played for her, a Schubert impromptu that was technically accomplished and emotionally honest in equal measure, and she hired him on the spot and then second-guessed herself for 20 minutes afterward, which she understood was the standard experience of making a decision before the fear caught up with it. She told Ethan about it that evening. Was the second-guessing useful? He asked. They were on the phone, which had become their default for weeknight conversations when Ava was asleep and the day had quieted down. No, she said. It was just noise. Then you made the right call. Or I made a call and it'll turn out to be right or wrong and I'll deal with it accordingly. That's a more honest version of what I said. I know. She was lying on the couch with the piano visible across the room, uncovered, the lamplight sitting on the keys the way it did at night. How was yours? The day? He told her. A board meeting that had run long, a problem with a portfolio company that was more people-shaped than numbers-shaped, a call with a lawyer about something she gathered was standard but irritating. She listened with the part of her brain that had gotten practiced at reading the texture of his days, which were the things he was genuinely worried about versus the things he was managing fine and mentioning for completeness. The manufacturing company, she said, the one in the Bronx. Did you ever... We closed that in August. What happened with the son? A pause. We brought in an operations consultant, someone his own age as it turned out, which wasn't planned but mattered. The two of them figured out that the son was good at things the father hadn't been interested in, technology integration mainly. The company's modernizing now. He paused again. The son called me last week, said things are better. That's good. Yeah, he said it quietly. It's good. She understood what he meant, that the work sometimes actually did what it was supposed to do, that the capacity to see what was broken and help fix it had genuine value, not just as a career architecture built around an old fear, but as a real thing he was good at, and that helped people. She was glad he could hold both of those truths at the same time. She'd watched him get there. I'm proud of you, she said. She said it simply, without building up to it. A silence on the line, then, thank you. He said it the way he accepted things he hadn't expected, with a slight catch, handled quickly. That means something. I know it does. That's why I said it. So, Ava's second piano lesson was better than the first, and her third was better than the second, which was the standard trajectory but still gratifying every time Megan watched it happen. Ava learned the way she did everything, with focused intensity punctuated by detours, her mind making connections that weren't always linear but usually landed somewhere interesting. In early November, she asked Megan why some songs made you cry, even when nothing sad had happened to you. You mean recently? Or ever? Either. Ava was sitting at the studio piano with her hands in her lap, not playing, thinking. I was listening to something on Uncle Ethan's speaker, and I felt like crying, and I wasn't sad about anything specific. What were you listening to? I don't know the name, It was piano, something slow. Was it the one he plays when he's working late, kind of starts quietly and builds? Ava looked at her. How do you know what he plays when he's working late? He told me once. You two talk about a lot of things. We do, Megan said. Ava accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most facts. So why did it make me want to cry? Megan thought about how to say it. Not the music theory version. That wouldn't be what the child was actually asking. Some music touches something in you that doesn't have words for itself, she said. It's not about being sad. It's more like music can reach the part of you that's been carrying something without knowing it. And when it gets there, the feeling has to come out somehow. Ava sat with that. Like pressure, she said. Yeah, like pressure. That happened when my mom used to play violin too. She said it quietly, looking at her hands on her lap. I'd be fine, and then she'd play, and I'd just feel everything all at once. That's what music does when it's working. Is that why you play? To feel everything at once? Megan looked at this small person who had, over the course of a year, asked her more useful questions about herself than most people managed in a lifetime. Partly, she said, and partly to feel less alone in the things I can't put into words. Ava nodded slowly. I want to be able to do that. You're already starting to. I'm still at the upset bird stage. Less upset than before. Ava considered this with appropriate seriousness. Then she put her hands back on the keys, found her position the way Megan had taught her, and played the scale they'd been working on. Not perfectly, the fourth finger still collapsing slightly on the way down, but with more weight in it than the last time, more intention. Like she was saying something with it rather than just executing it. Megan sat beside her and listened and felt the specific fullness of the moment. A child finding her way into music for the first time, in a room built for exactly that purpose, in the afternoon light that came through the west-facing windows and fell across the piano keys like the whole thing had been designed with this moment in mind. She thought, there are things you can't plan for. You can only make yourself ready enough to recognize them when they arrive. The things she'd told herself about fear, that she'd been protecting herself from a life she was already living, turned out to be the thought that kept returning when she needed it most. It came back to her in the moments when the old reflex rose up, the one that pulled toward smallness and safety and the managed diminishment of wanting things. She'd catch herself mid-contraction and think, no, I've been there. I know what that costs. It didn't always work. Some days the reflex was faster than the awareness, but she was getting better at catching it earlier, at recognizing the shape of the fear before it had fully organized itself into behavior. She called her mother in mid-November, a real call, not the Sunday ritual, a Tuesday afternoon call, unscheduled, which alone communicated something. Her mother, to her credit, answered on the second ring and didn't ask what was wrong. They talked for an hour, not about the things they usually talked about, logistics, health updates, the surface-level news of each other's lives, but about the actual things. Her mother talked about how it had been when Megan's father was sick, and she'd been holding everything together and hadn't told anyone how frightened she was because she'd needed to be the one who wasn't frightened. Megan talked about the audition and what had happened in the years afterward, which she'd only ever told her mother in the broad strokes. I thought you were just taking time, her mother said. I didn't know it had gotten so quiet for you. I didn't let it show. No, you're very good at that. A pause. Too good sometimes. I know. This man, her mother said carefully. Ethan. Yes. You sound different when you talk about him. You've sounded different for months. I was waiting to see if you'd say something. I'm saying something now. I noticed. Another pause. Is it good, or is it complicated? Both, Megan said, which I think means it's real. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father and I used to fight about the dishes for 15 years, every week, the same argument about how he loaded the dishwasher. She said it like she was telling a story she'd told before, but differently this time, with something new in it. I used to think it was about the dishes. It was never about the dishes. It was about how much space we gave each other and how much we took. Once we figured that out, the dishes thing went away. What was it actually about? He wanted to feel like his way of doing things had value, even in a small domestic task. I wanted to feel like I wasn't always being quietly corrected. She paused. Two people, two completely different fears, showing up as an argument about a dishwasher. Megan sat with that for a moment. That sounds familiar. I expect it does. She could hear her mother's smile in it. The thing is, we figured it out. It took us longer than it should have, and we were both more stubborn than was helpful. But we figured it out because we wanted to. I want to, Megan said. I know, her mother said. I can hear it. Mom, she started seeing a therapist in December. Not in response to any specific event. It had been building since the conversation with Carol, since the month of distance, and the things she'd understood about herself inside it. The therapist was a woman named Renata, who had an office on the east side and who, in their first session, said, "What are you hoping to get out of this?" in a tone that made clear she wanted a real answer, not the prepared one. Megan gave her the real one. She talked about her father and the piano and the audition and 4 years of managed smallness. She talked about Ethan and the realtor and the pattern she'd identified in herself. The retreat, the distance called thinking that was sometimes actually fear. She talked about learning to want things again and the specific terror of doing that, the way wanting things made you available for loss in a way that not wanting didn't. Renata listened. She asked questions that were not rhetorical and didn't have built-in answers. She said, near the end of the first session, "It sounds like you've done a lot of the work already. You're clear about the patterns. The question is whether the understanding is enough or whether there's still a gap between knowing and living." "There's a gap," Megan said. "Most people have one. That's what we're here for." She went every other week. It didn't solve anything in the way solving worked in her piano teaching. Clear progress, measurable improvement, the movement from one stage to the next. It was more like adjusting the action on a piano, small calibrations, most invisible, that changed the response of the instrument over time. She noticed the changes in the way she talked to Ethan, more directly, less hedging around the things she actually meant. When she was unsettled by something she said so earlier, before it had built up into 11 days of distance. When she was happy, she let him see it without immediately checking whether showing happiness was tactically wise. And Ethan, she watched him learn things too. He stopped presenting solutions. When she talked about the studio, he asked questions and followed her thinking and only offered his own perspective when she asked for it. And when he did offer it, he flagged it as his own perspective rather than the obvious answer. It wasn't always natural. She could see him catching himself sometimes, stopping mid-sentence to back up and ask instead of assert. The effort was visible, and she didn't make him feel bad about that visibility. It wasn't weakness to try. It was the opposite. In December, he told her, over dinner, that he'd asked his therapist about the planning behavior in the context of their relationship. "What did she say?" Megan asked. "She said I experienced love as responsibility, that caring about someone meant being responsible for their outcomes, and that the only way I knew to discharge that responsibility was to act, to fix, to prepare, to make things easier before they got hard." He said it evenly, like someone who'd had time to sit with the information. "She said it was a version of something I learned early, that love meant solving problems for people." "Where did you learn that?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother was sick for most of my teenage years. Not the same thing as your father. She was sick, and then better, and then sick again, for years. And I was the oldest. And what I learned was that the way to love her was to make sure she never had to worry about anything I could handle." He stopped. "She died not worrying about me. She would have told you that was a gift." "Was it?" "For her, maybe." He looked at his hands. "For me, it meant I learned to disappear inside the taking care of. I got so good at it that I forgot there was something underneath it." "What's underneath it?" He looked at her. The restaurant was doing its dinner thing around them, the warm noise of other people's lives. And in the middle of it, Ethan Sterling looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to catalog because there wasn't a category that fit it, that was just specifically his, open, careful, more present than he was comfortable being, and present anyway. "Fear that if I stop handling things, the people I love will leave," he said, "or die, or both." She held his gaze. She didn't soften it or smooth it over. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, "and I'm not a problem to be handled. and I need you to practice knowing the difference." "I know," he said. "I'm practicing." "I know you are." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, not as a resolution, as an acknowledgement of the distance they had traveled and the distance still in front of them and the decision, which neither of them had made formally or announced to anyone, to travel it together. Sarsum. The studio's first recital happened on a Saturday afternoon in early February, 8 months after Megan had signed the lease. She'd resisted calling it a recital. The word came with connotations she didn't want. The formality and the performance anxiety and the parents on folding chairs waiting to be impressed. She'd called it a sharing instead, which was accurate and which gave it a different quality from the first moment. The studio held 12 people comfortably. She'd set it up with mismatched chairs and 2 small tables with coffee and tea and cookies that Carol had made because Carol had asked if she could do something and Megan had said yes. Daniel had brought a few chairs from his own apartment. Ava had made name tags for everyone in her careful, distinctive handwriting. She'd been practicing her lettering and distributed them at the door with complete authority. Sophie played first. She was 8 now, and she'd been working on a piece by a lesser-known French composer that Megan had chosen specifically because it had a long phrase in the middle that required patience, the willingness to sit inside a moment that felt unresolved until it finally resolved. Sophie played it with her tongue slightly between her teeth in concentration, and in the long middle phrase she did what she'd been working toward for months. She sat inside it. She didn't rush. She waited for it. When she finished, she looked up, and Megan gave her the small nod that meant, yes, that was it. You did the thing. Marcus played a simplified Bach, which he'd asked for himself. He'd been the one, 3 months ago, to say, I think I want to learn something old, like actually old, which Megan had taken as the sign that he was no longer serving a sentence. He played it with slightly more speed than was ideal, and perfect rhythm throughout, and the expression of someone who was surprised to find himself somewhere he actually wanted to be. Priya played the Beethoven Sonata, the difficult one, not all of it, but the first movement. She'd been ready for 2 months and had been making herself wait, which Megan had encouraged because Priya needed to learn that readiness and rightness were not the same thing. She played it beautifully and knew it and handled the knowing with more grace than she would have 6 months ago. Carol played last. A piece she'd chosen herself, a short Sati Gymnopédie, 1 minute and 30 seconds, nothing technically demanding. She played it slowly and imperfectly. One small stumble in the second phrase that she moved through without stopping, and she played it with the quality that Megan had been teaching all year without always naming it, presence. The actual inhabiting of the sound rather than the execution of it. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet before the room responded, and in that moment, Megan felt the full weight of what she'd built. Not just the studio, not just the curriculum, but this. A room full of people who had sat down at a piano with varying degrees of reluctance or eagerness or fear and had been changed, in the specific way music changed people when you taught it right, which was not by installing technique, but by making the student less afraid of their own sound. She thought about her father's Gershwin records, and the girl in Cincinnati who had understood from an early age that music was the thing that made the interior life bearable by giving it somewhere to go. She thought about covering the piano for 8 months, and the specific grief of that, the loss that had no external cause. She thought about October of last year, a bell above a door, a child in a yellow rain jacket, and the things that had been set in motion by a single unlikely morning. She thought, this is where all of that was going. She thought, I couldn't have planned my way here. I had to get lost first. Ethan was at the back of the room. He'd been there for the whole thing, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not managing anything, just watching. She'd caught his eye twice during the afternoon, and both times he'd had the same expression, undone around the edges, entirely present, not trying to fix or improve or anticipate, just there. When the sharing ended and the room broke into the gentle noise of people talking and reaching for cookies and complimenting each other, he made his way to her, not pushing through, just moving steadily in her direction. That was something, he said. Yeah. She was still looking at the room, at Sophie explaining something to Carol with the animation of a child who'd found a topic she could talk about. I've been thinking, he said. She looked at him. I have something to ask you, he said. Not a plan, not a solution, just a question. Okay? He was looking at her with the unmanaged expression, the one she'd been cataloging since October of last year, without finding the right name for it. She had the name now. It was what a person looked like when they had stopped protecting themselves from wanting something. "Are you happy?" he said. "Not with me specifically, not with any of the specific parts. Just, are you happy? Is this life you're building the one you actually want?" She looked at him. She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things anymore. "Yes," she said. "It's not perfect, it's still a lot of work, but yeah, this is what I want." He nodded. "Good," he said. "I'm glad." He looked at the room and then back at her. "I'm glad you're happy. Even if I'm not. Even when I'm not the reason for it." That landed. She felt it land. "You're part of the reason," she said. "That's not nothing." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm working on believing it." The proposal happened at Carver's on a Tuesday in April, 14 months after the first one. She would tell people later, when people asked, which they did, that it was nothing like she would have expected, and that was exactly what made it right. No reservation at a fancy restaurant, no plan orchestrated for maximum effect. Just the two of them at the diner on a Tuesday morning, which was where they'd started, which was where they'd always been most fully themselves. She'd been early. She was filling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door rang, and she didn't need to look up to know it was him. She heard it the way she heard the resolution of a phrase she'd been waiting for. He sat at the counter. She brought his coffee. They talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. Ava's recorder, which had progressed from upset bird to merely surprised bird. A meeting he had later that he was mildly dreading. Whether the diner should get new chairs or just reupholster the existing ones, which had been a running conversation with the owner for 3 months. And then he was quiet for a moment. She looked up from wiping the counter, and he was looking at her with the expression that wasn't manageable and wasn't managed. "I have something to ask you," he said. She set the cloth down. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a ring on the counter between them. Not presented dramatically, just set down there, the way he'd have set down a coffee cup or his keys. A simple ring, 1 stone, nothing performative. The kind of thing chosen by someone who had thought carefully about who they were giving it to. "I didn't plan this out," he said. "I didn't map it or strategize it. I just knew this was the right place and this was the right morning and you're the right person, and I didn't want to wait until I had a better version of it." She was looking at the ring. She looked up at him. "Megan," he said, "will you marry me?" Joe appeared from the kitchen, took one look at the counter, and immediately disappeared again. Megan stood in the diner where she had worked for 4 years and spent 3.5 of them disappearing inside ordinary days. She stood where she'd been standing when a bell rang on an October morning 14 months ago, and a small girl had looked at her with unguarded eyes and decided, without explanation or qualification, that Megan was worth deciding on. She stood in the place that had been, against all her initial assessments of it, where things began. She looked at Ethan Sterling, who was not perfect and knew it, who had made mistakes she'd felt in the center of herself and had owned them without flinching, who was trying every day to be someone less defended and more present, who sang harmonies wrong in the car when he thought no one was listening, and who had looked at her from the beginning, not through her, not past her, but at her, specifically, in the way that felt like being known rather than handled. She thought about what she understood now that she hadn't understood 14 months ago, that love was not the absence of difficulty. It was the decision to stay inside the difficulty and work it through. It was presence, not protection. It was two people choosing every day to remain available to each other, even when the available parts included the complicated and unresolved ones. She thought about her father's Gershwin records, and the girl she'd been, and the woman she'd had to become to get here, and the piano she'd uncovered, and the music she'd come back to, and the room full of students who were learning that their own sound was worth listening to. She thought, I have been found by this life, and I have also chosen it. Yes, she said. The wedding was in September, not September of the same year. They gave themselves time, which was the thing they'd both learned to do. They planned it together, which was different from one person planning and the other person arriving to something already arranged. It took longer and required more conversations, and was more difficult in the specific way that doing things together honestly was more difficult than either doing them alone or having them done for you. The venue was small, an event space in Brooklyn that held 60 people, exposed brick, good light. Carol made something for the dessert table. Daniel played piano before the ceremony, a short Chopin nocturne, and then, because Ava had made a specific request, the first page of Clair de Lune, which made Megan stand in the anteroom with her eyes closed for a moment. Ava was the person who walked Megan down the aisle. Not instead of anyone. Megan's mother was there, seated, watching with an expression that Megan caught only a glimpse of before she had to look away, because she wasn't ready to cry yet. But Ava had asked, in her particular direct way, if she could. And Megan had said yes immediately, and that had been the decision. She walked with Ava's hand in hers, not being led, just connected. And at the end of the aisle, Ethan was standing with the expression she had no category for, the one that was specifically his. And Ava let go of Megan's hand and went to stand beside him, which was where she'd been all along. The ceremony was short. They'd written their own words, which had required more conversations and more revisions than either of them had anticipated, and which were better for it. What they said was honest and imperfect and did not promise things that couldn't be promised. They promised presence. They promised honesty. They promised to ask before deciding, to say the thing before it became 11 days of silence, to be afraid sometimes and admit to it. When it was done, someone in the back of the room started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and Ava had Franklin tucked under her arm. She'd brought him, because Franklin was well-traveled, and this was a significant occasion. And Ethan was looking at Megan, and she was looking back, and the room was full of the specific warmth of people who had shown up for something that mattered. In the years that followed, people would sometimes ask how they'd met. The diner story was the easy version, and they told it. The fuller version, the 11 days of distance, the realtor, the park conversation, the two people learning in parallel how to stop protecting themselves from their own lives. That was the version they told less often, and only to people who could hold the complications of it. Not because they were ashamed of it, because it was theirs. The difficult specific history of two people who hadn't arrived here easily and knew that the not easily was the point. The studio expanded in the second year. Daniel brought in 2 more teachers. Megan taught primarily, though less than before. She'd become the thing she'd designed the program to be, the person who shaped the philosophy rather than carrying all of it personally. She still had her own students. She still played every night, usually late, usually after Ava was in bed in the room down the hall that had been hers since they moved into the brownstone on West 86th. The one Ethan had found before asking her, the one she'd chosen herself when she was ready. Ava turned 9 that winter and 10 the winter after, and kept becoming more specifically herself with each increment. She played piano at the studio every Saturday with a seriousness that had become technically genuine. She was good, actually good, in the way that revealed itself around her second year of study when the naturalness of her ears started catching up to the mechanics of her hands. She still brought Franklin to lessons, though he rode in her backpack now rather than under her arm, concession to the dignity appropriate to her age. The recorder had been retired. The piano had won. On ordinary evenings, the kind that most evenings were, which Megan had learned to pay attention to rather than through, the 3 of them ate dinner together and talked about the day, and sometimes argued about small things, and sometimes sat in companionable quiet that none of them felt the need to fill. Ethan cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Megan cooked the other nights. Ava had opinions about all of it. They watched things together. They had routines that had accumulated without being designed. Sometimes Ethan still got ahead of himself. He was wired the way he was wired, and rewiring was slow, even when it was real. He'd find himself mid-solution on something that hadn't been offered to him to solve, and he'd catch it, usually, and back up to the question. Sometimes Megan caught it first and said so, directly, without drama, and he'd receive that without defending himself. They'd both learned that the catching was not an accusation. It was just maintenance. The ongoing work of being honest people in an honest relationship. Sometimes Megan went quiet when she should have said something, retreated into the interior when the interior wasn't actually where the problem was. Ethan noticed this now. He knew the shape of her silences well enough to distinguish them. He'd ask, "What's happening?" not "What's wrong?" That had been their first conversation about it, That wrong assumed something had failed, and what was actually happening was usually just that she needed a moment. So he asked what was happening, and she told him, and they worked with it. This was not a perfect life. It had the specific imperfections of any real life. Money worries occasionally, health scares once, Ava going through a period at 11 that required more patience than any of them had on certain days. The ordinary grief of time passing that brought its small losses along with everything else. There were weeks when the studio felt like a burden, and weeks when it felt like exactly what it was. There were days when Ethan and Megan were simply tired of each other in the way that people who live together sometimes were, and those days were fine. They were part of it. But what they'd built was real in the way that things were real when they'd been tested and had held. When Megan sat at the piano in the evenings, the good upright she'd moved from her old apartment, which stood now in the living room, uncovered, always uncovered. She played for herself and for anyone who wanted to listen, and what she played was different now than it had been in the apartment on West 104th. Not technically different. Different in the way that sound was different when the person making it had stopped being afraid of what they'd hear. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had covered the piano, who had spent years reducing her own dimensions to something more manageable, safer, less exposed to the possibility of loss. She thought about that woman without contempt and without sentimentality. Just recognition. That had been a real person doing the best she could with what she understood at the time. What she understood now was different. What she understood now was that the wanting was not the dangerous part. The wanting was the point. That a life organized around the avoidance of loss was a life already lost. That love was not a gamble you took despite the risk of pain, but a thing you moved toward because the alternative, the careful, managed, sufficiently defended life, was its own kind of pain, quieter and longer lasting and harder to name. She thought about Ava saying, "You look like someone who used to be happy." A 6-year-old's assessment delivered with complete confidence and no awareness that it was one of the most accurate things anyone had said to her in years. She thought, she was right. And I didn't know I looked like that until someone said it out loud. That was the other thing she understood now. The thing she tried to teach her students, the thing she'd learned the hard way and kept relearning in smaller ways. You couldn't see yourself clearly from the inside. You needed the outside to tell you what you looked like, which meant you needed people. Specific people who would look at you honestly and say the thing they saw, even when it was the thing you weren't ready to hear. She had those people now. She'd made herself available for them. One evening, in the second winter, Ava came into the living room while Megan was playing and sat on the floor beside the piano bench, the way she'd sat outside her mother's door years ago, not asking for anything except to be near the music. Ethan came in a few minutes later and sat on the couch and picked up the book he'd been reading and didn't read it. Megan played for another half hour. Nothing in particular. One thing leading to the next, the way music led when you weren't performing it, but simply following where it went. At some point, Ava had put her head against the piano leg and was nearly asleep. At some point, Ethan had set the book down. She played until she was done. The quiet after it was the specific quiet of a house where people were at rest. "What was that?" Ethan asked, softly, not wanting to break the quality of the room. "Nothing specific," she said. "Just what came out." He nodded. He looked at Ava on the floor. "She's out." "She's been out for 20 minutes. He got up and crouched beside Ava the way he'd done in Megan's old apartment the first night she'd babysat, with the practiced gentleness of someone who had learned exactly how to bring this specific child back from sleep without frightening her. Ava surfaced, gathered herself, and made her way toward her room with the quiet dignity of someone who considered themselves too old to be carried but didn't object when Ethan's hand stayed on her shoulder all the way down the hall. He came back into the living room. He sat on the couch, and she moved from the piano bench to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her in the simple domestic way that still made something in her chest do the thing it did. Outside, the city was being the city. Winter dark, relentless, alive in the specific way it was alive at night when the noise was lower and the lights were on everywhere, the whole enormous thing going about its business. Inside, the piano was still warm. She thought, I used to be someone who covered that. She thought, I will never understand fully how I got from there to here. There was no plan that could have produced this. There was only the accumulation of small choices, made imperfectly, over a long time, in the direction of the life she actually wanted. She thought, and that is the only way anything real is ever built. She thought, that's enough. That's more than enough. She leaned against Ethan. He was already half asleep. The city moved outside the window, the way it always moved, the way it had always moved and would always move. Without waiting, without slowing, without asking anyone whether they were ready. She was ready. She had been ready. She understood now, for longer than she'd known. She just needed the bell above a door and a small girl in a yellow rain jacket and a Tuesday morning in October to show her where to begin.